Chapter 1. Izuku Midoriya had spent most of his life believing that heroism was a language spoken only by the gifted, and that he, quirkless and small for his age, would never learn its grammar. He filled notebook after notebook with observations anyway, sketching the way Kamui Woods bent his wooden limbs around a burning window frame, timing how long it took Mount Lady to clear a collapsed overpass, because watching was the one thing nobody could take from him. His mother cried more than she needed to when he told her his dream was still alive after the doctor's verdict, and Bakugo laughed less kindly than a friend should when Izuku said it out loud in the schoolyard. Still, he watched, and he wrote, and he waited for a world that did not seem to be waiting for him. The sludge villain changed everything. Izuku had not planned to run toward danger that afternoon, his body had simply decided before his mind caught up, propelled by the sight of Bakugo choking under a living tide of grime with no hero brave enough to close the last few meters. All Might, worn down to a skeleton of himself after a morning of quiet favors and hidden bleeding, watched a quirkless boy hurl his backpack and his whole small life at a monster, and something in the number one hero's chest cracked open. Izuku woke up in a hospital bed to a confession he had not been ready for, a symbol of peace admitting he was breaking, and an offer that sounded like a fairy tale, one for all, passed hand to hand for generations, was his if he wanted it enough to survive receiving it. He wanted it enough to eat All Might's hair for 10 months, to vomit blood into a toilet after every training session, to rebuild a beach one bag of trash at a time until his body could finally hold the power without shattering. By the time the UA entrance exam arrived, Izuku was not the same boy who had once been told his dream was impossible. He was still afraid, still uncertain of his own strength, but he had learned that fear did not have to be the last word. The exam grounds were louder than he expected, a churning mass of hopeful teenagers all pretending not to size each other up. Izuku recognized a few faces from prep videos and hero forums, the usual crowd of confident overachievers, but it was a girl standing near the entrance gate who caught his attention without trying. She was tall, dark-haired, poised in the particular way that came from expecting to be watched and choosing not to mind it. When a proctor's assistant fumbled an armful of testing packets, she was the first to kneel down and help gather them, murmuring an apology that was not hers to give, as if competence and kindness were simply two settings on the same instrument. Izuku did not know her name yet. He only knew that something in the easy grace of the gesture made him look twice, and that looking twice at a stranger was not something he did. The written portion passed in a blur of formulas and villain classification questions that Izuku had memorized so thoroughly he barely needed to think. It was the practical exam that mattered, 10 minutes of chaos in a mock city built to reward exactly the kind of overachieving he had trained his whole life to become. He heard the announcement of points, the rules about 0-pointers, and filed it all away the way he filed everything, methodically, nervously, hungry for a plan. When the gates opened and the crowd of examinees scattered into the fake city, Izuku caught one more glimpse of the tall girl before the sea of competitors swallowed her whole. She moved with a controlled economy of motion, already producing something from her bare skin that he could not quite identify at that distance, and he filed that away too, half fascination and half professional curiosity, the way he filed away every quirk he had never seen before. He did not expect to see her again inside of 5 minutes. Crouched in an alley with her palms pressed to her own forearm, sweat beading at her temple as she willed a length of rope into existence out of nothing but concentration and the raw material converted from her own fat reserves. She was breathing hard. The rope she had already produced was tangled uselessly around her ankle rather than around the three-pointer robot bearing down on her position, and for one unguarded second, the composed girl from the gate looked exactly as frightened as everyone else pretending not to be. Izuku did not decide to help her so much as discover that he already had, his body carrying him into the alley a half-second before his brain finished the calculation. He kicked the robot's forelimb out from under it with a full cowling-assisted strike that cracked concrete and sent a jolt of pain lancing up his own leg, an old habit he had not fully broken. The machine crashed sideways into a dumpster, its point value lighting panel flickering, and the girl scrambled back with wide eyes fixed on him instead of the threat. "You didn't have to do that," she said, already reaching for the rope tangled around her ankle, freeing herself with quick, competent fingers even as her voice came out steadier than her hands. "I had a plan." "I could tell," Izuku said, which was a lie, and then immediately regretted lying to someone he had just met. "I mean, I saw you making the rope, that's an incredible quirk. Is it some kind of creation ability? Do you need physical contact with a surface or can you just, extrude it directly from? She blinked at him, and for a moment he was sure he had ruined the entire exchange with his mouth running ahead of his manners, exactly the way it always did whenever a new quirk crossed his path. But instead of the polite retreat he expected, something in her expression eased into faint, surprised amusement. Yayarozau Momo, she said, offering her name like a handshake. Creation. I convert my own fat cells into any inorganic matter I can fully picture on a molecular level. You're right that I don't need a surface. I do need to concentrate, which is the part that just went badly. Midoriya Izuku, he managed, and then, because the 10-minute clock was still bleeding away around them, we should probably split up before another one finds us, but, thank you, for telling me that, it was really interesting. Something about the sincerity in the last sentence, delivered by a strange, muttering boy in the middle of a life-altering exam, made Yayarozau laugh, short and startled, before she caught herself and nodded once, formally, as if resetting to the composure she preferred to present to the world. Good luck, Midoriya, she said, and was gone around the corner before he could answer, chasing the point total the exam demanded of her. Izuku spent the rest of the 10 minutes fighting robots with a strange lightness in his chest that had nothing to do with adrenaline, and when the horn sounded and the exhausted examinees filed back out through the gates, he found himself scanning the crowd for dark hair and a straight spine before he even noticed he was doing it. He told himself it was nothing, a passing spark of curiosity about an interesting quirk, the same reflex that had filled a dozen notebooks with strangers' abilities since he was 4 years old. It did not feel like nothing. It felt, absurdly, like the first page of something he did not yet have a word for. Chapter 2. The acceptance letter arrived the way All Might had promised it would, with a projected recording and a scoring breakdown that made Izuku's mother sob into a dish towel for the second time that year. Rescue points, it turned out, existed, awarded for the kind of split-second interference he had barely thought about as anything other than instinct. He had assumed the small kindness in that alley would cost him rank. Instead it had built it. The first day of class at UA arrived with the particular anxiety of every first day Izuku had ever survived, sharpened by the knowledge that this one actually mattered. He found classroom 1A after a wrong turn and a moment of panic in a hallway that all looked identical, slipped through the door with his heart hammering, and nearly walked face first into a broad chest that turned out to belong to a boy already introducing himself at extravagant volume to the room at large. Izuku found his assigned seat, 3rd row, and was still settling his bag when a familiar voice, cooler and more controlled than the boy currently declaring his engine quirk to anyone within earshot, spoke from just behind him. Midoriya, correct? We met during the practical exam. He turned to find Yayarozau occupying the seat directly behind his own, hair pulled back today instead of loose, uniform crisp in a way that made his own feel slightly rumpled by comparison. He had not let himself hope that she would end up in the same class. 80 applicants had scored high enough for a top 20 course of study across 2 full sections, and the odds had not felt worth doing math on. Yayarozau, right, hi, I didn't expect, that's a coincidence, isn't it, both of us in 1A, he said, and then winced internally at how much that sentence had managed to say without saying anything. A pleasant one, she said simply, and something in the plain honesty of it settled his nerves more than a longer, more careful answer would have. I wanted to thank you properly for the exam. I looked up the footage afterward. You gave up several seconds of your own scoring window to intervene. It wasn't, anyone would have, Izuku started, and stopped himself, because it was not entirely true and they both knew it. Not everyone had stopped. You would have gotten out of it on your own. I just made it faster. Perhaps, Yayarozau allowed, in a tone that suggested she did not fully believe it but had decided not to argue the point on their first day. Regardless. Thank you. Their homeroom teacher arrived in a sleeping bag, delivered a quirk assessment test disguised as an orientation exercise, and expelled no one despite threatening to, and by the end of that first chaotic day Izuku had a working map of his new classmates, Bakugo's temper, unchanged by Yue's prestige, Uraraka's easy warmth, Ida's rigid, well-meaning formality, Todoroki's careful distance. Yayarozau occupied her own particular space in that map almost immediately, not loud, not showy, but visibly the person other students gravitated toward when a problem needed solving rather than shouting about. Izuku noticed the way she double-checked Uraraka's grip during a quirk trial, the way she offered Kaminari a spare pencil without being asked, the way she seemed to catalog the room the same restless way Izuku catalogued quirks, except her notebook was people instead of powers. He told himself, walking home that evening with his own notebook heavier by 3 pages of fresh observations, that it was simply interesting to watch someone that competent operate. He almost believed it. The weeks that followed folded classes into training exercises into the low hum of ordinary friendship, and Izuku found reasons, entirely reasonable and unplanned ones, to end up paired with Yayarozau more often than pure chance should have allowed. A study session before a support course exam turned into 2 hours at the library, her explaining material density calculations with the patient thoroughness of someone who genuinely enjoyed teaching, him filling margins with diagrams until she finally admitted, with visible reluctance, that his visual notes were more useful than her own outlines. "You could have simply said you didn't need my help," she said, not quite hiding a smile behind the textbook she was pretending to reread. "I did need it," Izuku said honestly. "I just also like listening to you explain things. You make it sound like the material wants to cooperate instead of like it's fighting you." Yayarozau went quiet at that, an unreadable pause that lasted a beat too long, and for a moment Izuku worried he had said something wrong. Then she looked back down at the textbook and said, in a voice slightly less composed than before, "That's a kind thing to say," and neither of them mentioned it again, though Izuku carried the sentence around in his chest for the rest of the week like a small, warm stone. He was aware, in the analytical part of his brain that never fully switched off, of what the pattern of his own behavior implied. He noticed things about her that had nothing to do with quirk analysis, the specific line of concentration between her eyebrows when a creation required unusual density, the way she said thank you to support staff by name rather than by role, the low, genuine laugh she almost never let show in public and that he had somehow, twice now, managed to earn. He did not have a name for it yet, not one he was ready to write down, but the notebook in the back of his mind was filling up all the same. Chapter 3. The USJ was supposed to be a lesson in disaster zone rescue tactics. It became, instead, the first real test of whether the class could survive an actual villain infiltration, and Izuku spent the opening seconds of the attack doing the thing he always did under pressure, freezing for exactly as long as it took to catalog the threat, and then moving. The warp villain's portal scattered the class across the facility's simulated disaster zones before anyone had a plan, and Izuku found himself in the flood zone with Tsuyu and, a moment later, sprinting footsteps and controlled breathing announcing Yayarozau's arrival at his side, having navigated the chaos toward the sound of trouble rather than away from it, the way she generally did. "Status," she said, already scanning the water for threats, voice clipped into the same efficient register she used during timed exams. "Multiple villains, we don't know numbers yet, Aizawa-sensei's fighting the ones near the entrance," Izuku reported, matching her clipped pace out of instinct. "We need to regroup with the others, but there's a group headed toward the central plaza where Bakugo and the others got dropped, and I don't think we have time to wait for a teacher." Yayarozau's jaw tightened, the look of someone doing rapid cost-benefit arithmetic on a decision no 17-year-old should have had to make alone. "Then we move toward the plaza and we keep the villains focused on us instead of the students who haven't fought before. Midoriya, I have rope, restraints, basic defensive plating if we need it, and enough steel to improvise. Tell me what you need and I'll produce it." There was no hesitation in the offer, no posturing, just a straightforward inventory of what she could give him and a trust, entirely unearned by any objective measure of their short acquaintance, that he would use it well. Izuku felt something in his chest steady under the weight of that trust rather than buckle beneath it. "Rope, if you can make it fast, I want to slow down whoever's closest to the plaza entrance without going in swinging blind," he said, and she was already producing it before he finished the sentence, coils of taut, reinforced cord solidifying out of nothing across her palms. They moved together after that with an unspoken rhythm that surprised them both, Izuku's full cowling clearing obstacles and closing distance, Yayarozau's creations providing the tools that turned his raw momentum into something closer to precision. When a villain lunged for Yayarozau from a blind angle, Izuku's shoulder caught the blow meant for her ribs, and when Izuku overextended a strike and left himself open on the follow-through, a length of steel cable she had produced without breaking stride wrapped the villain's ankle and dropped him flat before he could capitalize. They found the others eventually, found the warped villain and the towering, half-formed creature that had come for All Might specifically, found the number one hero himself arriving at the last possible second to end the confrontation the way only he could. By the time it was over, Izuku's body ached in a dozen new places and Yayorozu's hands trembled faintly from the sheer volume of mass she had converted in under an hour, and they sat side by side against a wrecked support pillar in the aftermath, letting the adrenaline drain out of them in silence. "You didn't hesitate," Izuku said eventually, not quite looking at her. "When I said we should go in without waiting for a teacher. Most people would have hesitated. You didn't hesitate either," Yayorozu said. "I decided that was worth trusting." It was such a simple sentence, delivered without any particular weight behind it, and it still landed somewhere in Izuku's chest with more force than the villain's earlier blow had. He glanced sideways at her, at the exhausted, unguarded line of her profile, hair coming loose from its tie, and understood with sudden, uncomfortable clarity that the notebook he had been keeping in the back of his mind for weeks now had a name written at the top of it after all, whether he was ready to say it out loud or not. He did not say it out loud. He filed it away instead, the way he filed everything that mattered too much to risk handling carelessly, and helped her to her feet when the all-clear was finally called. Chapter 4. The sports festival announcement sent the entire first-year class into a low simmer of nerves that lasted a full week, and Izuku spent most of that week half listening to Bakugo's declarations of dominance while privately running calculations about which classmates he was most likely to face and how badly that would go for him. He had not expected the calculation to include the specific, uncomfortable question of what it would mean to compete against Yayorozu directly, and yet there it was, lodged in his thoughts at inconvenient hours. The obstacle race opened the festival in typical chaos, 400 students funneled through a narrow tunnel and out into a field of robotic wreckage left over from the entrance exam, repurposed as an opening bottleneck. Izuku used it as a springboard, quite literally, launching himself over the worst of the congestion with a controlled burst of full cowling that left his shins aching in the familiar way he had learned to tolerate. He caught sight of Yayorozu midway through the second obstacle, a canyon spanned by nothing but a scattering of narrow footholds, producing a lightweight glider from her own reserves with the calm efficiency of someone who had clearly planned 3 moves ahead of the obstacle itself. She landed the crossing cleanly, folded the glider's frame back into raw material rather than waste the momentum carrying dead weight, and was gone ahead of him before Izuku fully processed how elegant the solution had been. He filed it away, the way he filed everything about her now, half admiration and half the old professional instinct that refused to fully separate itself from the newer, warmer feeling underneath it. He placed respectably in the qualifying rounds, well enough to advance, and found himself paired into a cavalry battle team with Uraraka, Ida, and, in a stroke of luck he chose not to examine too closely, Yayorozu herself, drafted onto their small horse formation for her defensive fabrication abilities. They spent the 10-minute battle a tight, coordinated unit, Yayorozu producing shields and countermeasures on the fly while Ida anchored their footing and Uraraka's quirk kept their formation light enough to dodge, and Izuku found himself laughing, actually laughing, in the middle of a supposedly cutthroat competition, buoyed by the specific joy of fighting alongside someone whose instincts matched his own without either of them needing to explain themselves. "You're smiling," Yayorozu observed during a lull, breathless and flushed from exertion, a stray lock of hair plastered to her temple. "So are you," Izuku pointed out, and she blinked, evidently surprised to be caught at it, before the smile widened rather than retreating. The one-on-one tournament bracket, when it was posted, put Izuku up against a support course transfer with an unpredictable long-range quirk in the first round, a match he survived through raw stubbornness and a badly bruised arm, and Yayorozu against a boy whose quirk let him harden the air itself into temporary barriers. Izuku watched her match from the stands with his heart in his throat in a way that had nothing to do with the outcome of the tournament and everything to do with the sight of her taking a hit she had not fully guarded against, staggering, and then rallying with a barrage of improvised restraints that ended the fight decisively in her favor. He was on his feet before he realized he had stood, both hands fisted at his sides, exhaling only once she raised her arm in victory. Their own paths did not cross in the bracket until the semi-final round, an accident of seeding that felt, in the moment the pairing was posted, less like luck and more like the tournament itself conspiring against Izuku's ability to think clearly. He found her afterward in a quiet equipment corridor before the match, both of them staring at the same bracket sheet as if it might rearrange itself if they looked hard enough. I don't want this to be strange, Yayorozu said finally, arms crossed, gaze fixed somewhere over his shoulder rather than on his face. I intend to fight you seriously. I hope you'll do the same. I will, Izuku said, and meant it, even as something in his chest twisted at the thought of standing across from her with intent to win. I want you to know, whatever happens out there, it doesn't change anything about how I think of you. He had not planned to say that last part. It came out anyway, quiet and a little too honest for a hallway 5 minutes before a nationally televised match, and Yayorozu's composed expression cracked for just a moment into something softer and more startled before she recovered it. It doesn't change anything for me either, she said, and the small, private smile that followed stayed with Izuku all the way out onto the arena floor, where he fought her with everything he had and lost narrowly to a wall of improvised steel he simply could not break through in time, and found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind losing nearly as much as he had expected to. Chapter 5. Third place felt like a strange thing to be proud of, but Izuku found that he was, standing on the podium with his ribs still aching and Todoroki beside him in matching bruised silence, watching Bakugo accept second place with the particular fury of someone who had wanted first and would not stop wanting it. Yayorozu had placed in the final 8, respectable and hard one, and found Izuku afterward in the milling crowd of exhausted competitors with 2 bottles of water, handing him one without comment as if it were simply the natural continuation of a conversation they had not finished. You fought well, he told her, and meant every word of it. That wall technique, I've never seen density layering like that. You must have been practicing the geometry for weeks. Since the entrance exam, actually, Yayorozu admitted. I decided early that if I was going to compensate for a support quirk in a combat-heavy course, I needed offense and defense that didn't require anyone else's cooperation to work. You don't have a support quirk, Izuku said immediately, the correction rising in him before he could stop it. Creation is one of the most versatile combat quirks in the class. You just haven't had to prove that to anyone who mattered yet. Yayorozu went very still at that, water bottle halfway to her lips, and Izuku worried for a moment that he had overstepped some line he hadn't seen. Then she set the bottle down and said, quietly, nobody's put it that plainly before. Not even my instructors. Well, it's true, Izuku said, a little helplessly, because it was, and because the look on her face made something in his chest ache in a way he did not have adequate vocabulary for yet. The sports festival's aftermath brought internship offers flooding in for students who had placed well, a real, working confrontation with the fact that their fictional battles were rehearsals for actual professional lives. Izuku's offer sheet, when it arrived, carried more names than he had expected, evidence of the hidden gratitude of pro heroes who had watched a quirkless boy claw his way into relevance through sheer refusal to quit. He chose a placement that would put him in the field with real rescue work rather than flashy combat, the kind of choice that would have made his notebook-keeping childhood self proud. Yayorozu's own offer sheet, when she showed it to him during a quiet moment between classes the following week, was thinner than some of their classmates, a fact that visibly stung her more than she wanted to admit, until Izuku pointed out, with the same directness that seemed to keep landing somewhere important with her, that agencies built around flashy offense would never know what to do with someone whose real gift was solving problems other quirks couldn't touch. You'll end up somewhere that actually needs you, he told her. And they'll be lucky. She studied him for a long moment after that, an expression on her face he could not quite name, somewhere between gratitude and something warmer, something that made his own pulse stumble slightly under the weight of being looked at that carefully. You have a way of saying things that make me believe them, she said finally. Even when I'm not sure I believe them myself. Izuku did not have a good answer for that, not one that wouldn't have said far more than he was ready to say out loud, standing in a school hallway with finals looming and a first year of hero training still ahead of them both. He settled instead for a smile he hoped conveyed some fraction of what he meant, and if Yayorozu's own smile in return lingered a beat longer than the moment strictly required, neither of them mentioned it, filing the exchange away, each in their own private notebook, for a future neither of them was quite brave enough to name yet. Chapter 6. The internship placed Izuku with a mid-tier rescue agency in a district still recovering from a warehouse fire 2 months prior, work that consisted mostly of structural assessment, victim triage drills, and the unglamorous grind of learning how a real hero's day actually unfolded outside the arena spotlight. He wrote to his mother every few nights, called Uraraka once to compare notes on their respective placements, and found himself, more often than he wanted to admit, composing half-finished messages to Yayarozau that he deleted before sending, unsure what to say that wouldn't sound like more than a friend should say to a friend during a 2-week separation. She solved the problem for him by texting first, a photograph of a support gear prototype she had helped design during her own placement with a material science-focused agency, captioned only with a question about tensile strength that assumed, correctly, he would find it as fascinating as she did. Izuku answered within a minute, and the two of them spent the rest of that first week trading messages at odd hours, quirk theory and agency gossip and, eventually, the smaller things too, a description of a sunset over the recovering district, a complaint about agency coffee, the specific loneliness of being 17 and away from the people who made a strange new world feel survivable. He caught himself smiling at his phone more than once in front of his supervising hero, a broad-shouldered rescue specialist named Takeda who noticed everything and said nothing directly, until the 3rd week, when he handed Izuku a bottle of water during a break and remarked, apropos of nothing, "Whoever's got you smiling like that during silent watch duty, don't let a busy schedule talk you out of telling them." Izuku nearly dropped the bottle. "It's not, I mean, we're just friends, it's not like that." Takeda gave him a look that suggested he had heard that particular denial from younger heroes more times than he could count, and said only, "Sure, kid," before returning to the day's assessment reports, and Izuku spent the rest of his shift turning the older man's easy certainty over in his mind like a stone he could not quite set down. The internship ended with a joint debrief session back at UA that put the whole class in the same auditorium for the first time in weeks, comparing scars and stories in the loud, relieved way of people who had missed each other more than any of them would say out loud. Izuku found Yayarozau near the back, mid-conversation with Uraraka about a design problem, and the sight of her, unremarkable in every practical sense, standing in a school hallway in her uniform again, hit him with a force that had nothing practical about it at all. "You cut your hair," he blurted, before he had fully processed that it was true, a few inches shorter than before, framing her face in a way that made something catch in his throat. "Agency policy, for safety around the equipment," Yayarozau said, self-consciously touching the new length. "Is it terrible?" "No," Izuku said, too fast, too honest. No. It suits you." She held his gaze for a moment longer than the exchange required, something unreadable passing behind her eyes, before Uraraka's cheerful interruption dissolved the moment into ordinary group conversation, and Izuku spent the rest of the debrief with his ears faintly warm and his pulse refusing to fully settle, aware that whatever he had been telling himself about friendship was growing steadily harder to believe. Chapter 7. The Wild Pussycats training camp arrived with the promise of a week's intensive quirk refinement in the mountains, an itinerary that lasted exactly as long as it took the League of Villains to identify the camp's location and send Muscular and a squad of hired thugs to test it. Izuku found himself separated from most of his classmates in the chaos of the initial retreat, paired instead with Koda, the caretaker's grandson, a boy who wanted nothing to do with heroes and got one anyway, hurled directly into his path. The fight against Muscular tore something loose in Izuku's arm that took weeks to fully heal and left him with a decision, made in a half-second of instinct that felt entirely correct even in retrospect, to break his own bones rather than let a child die in front of him. He carried Koda out of that ravine on legs that barely worked, delivered him to the evacuation point, and collapsed against a boulder only once the boy was safely in the care of the counselors who came running. It was Yayarozau who found him there minutes later, having fought her own engagement against a separate infiltrator elsewhere on the mountain, producing an improvised splint and emergency bandaging with hands that were not quite steady, kneeling in the dirt beside him without a trace of the composure she usually wore like armor. "You could have died," she said, low and fierce, wrapping his ruined arm with careful, precise motions that belied the tremor in her voice. "Izuku, you could have died, and I wasn't there, and I didn't know until." It was the first time she had used his given name, and it landed in the wreckage of that mountainside with more weight than either of them seemed prepared for. Izuku, exhausted past the point of careful self-editing, reached for her free hand with his uninjured one and held it, and she let him, both of them silent for a long moment while the sounds of the ongoing operation continued somewhere distant around them. "I'm here," he said finally, voice rough. "I'm okay. You don't have to worry." "I do, though," Yayarozau said, and something in the plain, unguarded honesty of the admission made Izuku's chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with his broken arm. "I worry about you constantly, and I don't entirely know what to do with that." Neither did he, not with a villain attack still technically unresolved around them and a splint that needed finishing and 100 other urgent things demanding their attention, but in that suspended, exhausted moment, hands still held loosely in hers, Izuku understood that whatever he had been calling friendship for the better part of a year had grown into something with its own gravity, pulling at both of them whether either was ready to name it or not. The camp's full aftermath took days to sort through, injuries catalogued, villains apprehended or fled, the entire class shaken by how close the danger had cut. Izuku spent much of the recovery period with his arm in a proper cast, unable to train, and found that Yayarozau made a habit of appearing during his enforced downtime with schoolwork, or tea, or simply company, sitting beside his hospital bed with a book she rarely seemed to actually read, more focused on watching him rest than on the pages in front of her. "You don't have to keep coming," he told her once, not because he wanted her to stop but because the growing certainty of what her presence meant to him had started to feel like something he needed to acknowledge honestly rather than let drift. "I know," Yayarozau said simply, not looking up from the unread page. "I want to." It was such a small sentence, and it settled something in Izuku that had been unsettled since a rope-tangled alley on exam day, a certainty that had been building quietly under every study session and every shared victory and every quiet worry exchanged between them, until there was no longer any honest way to call it anything other than what it was. Chapter 8. The confession, when it finally happened, was almost anticlimactic in its simplicity, arriving not with fireworks or a grand gesture but on an ordinary evening on the UA dormitory rooftop, where Izuku had gone to clear his head after a hard training session and found Yayarozau already there, watching the city lights flicker on below the campus perimeter. "I keep thinking about the entrance exam," he said, coming to stand beside her at the railing, the late autumn air cold enough to fog both their breath. "About the alley, and the rope, and how strange it was that helping you felt like the easiest decision I'd made in weeks, when everything else about that day was terrifying." "I think about it too," Yayarozau admitted, not turning her head, though something in her posture had gone carefully still, the way it did whenever a conversation approached ground she wasn't sure how to navigate. "More often than I probably should, for a single 10-minute encounter." "I like you," Izuku said, because he had run out of ways to say it sideways, because the notebook in the back of his mind had been full for months and it was long past time to let someone else read a page of it. "Not just as a classmate, or a friend, though you're both of those things too, and they matter to me. I like you the way that makes it hard to think straight sometimes, and I've been trying to talk myself out of saying so because I didn't want to make things strange between us, but I don't think I can keep doing that anymore." The silence that followed lasted only a handful of seconds, though it felt considerably longer, Izuku's heart hammering against his ribs with an intensity that made the fight against muscular feel almost restful by comparison. Then Yayarozau turned to face him fully, and the composed mask she wore for the rest of the world had fallen away entirely, replaced by something open and unguarded and, unmistakably, glad. "I've been keeping a private ranking, if you want to know the truth," she said, a faint, helpless laugh threading through the words. "Of every reason I had to believe this was only a passing fixation, so that I wouldn't have to admit it wasn't. I've been failing to convince myself for months." "Is that a yes?" Izuku asked, half laughing himself now, giddy with a relief so total it left him lightheaded. "It's an unambiguous yes," Yayarozau said, and closed the distance between them, and Izuku met her halfway, and the kiss that followed was careful and a little uncertain and entirely, thoroughly perfect, two people who had spent a year building trust on battlefields and in libraries finally allowing that trust to become something softer. They stood together at the railing afterward for a long while, her head resting against his shoulder, his arm around her, neither in any hurry to return to the noise of the dormitory below, and Izuku found himself thinking, with the clarity that only comes after a long-held breath finally releases, that whatever came next, whatever villains and trials and impossible battles still waited on the road toward becoming the heroes they both wanted to be, He wanted to walk that road with her beside him. News of the relationship spread through Class 1A with the particular speed reserved for developments the entire class had apparently been expecting for months, greeted with far less surprise and far more enthusiastic teasing than either of them anticipated. Uraraka hugged Yayorozu so hard she nearly knocked her over. Ida delivered a lengthy, entirely sincere speech about the importance of maintaining academic focus despite romantic developments that had everyone laughing before he finished. Even Bakugo, grudging and gruff, offered a version of congratulations that amounted to a single scoff and the words "took you long enough, Deku," which from him counted as genuine warmth. Izuku barely registered the noise around them. He was too busy watching Yayorozu laugh at something Mina had said, hair catching the afternoon light, looking as settled and certain in that ordinary classroom moment as she had looked composed on the day they met, and thinking that whatever the future held, it had already given him more than he had ever let himself hope for as a quirkless boy filling notebooks with other people's power. Chapter 9. The peace did not last, because peace rarely did in a world built around heroes and the villains who opposed them, and the first sign of what was coming arrived less than a month later in the form of a name that made every pro-hero in Japan go quiet when it was mentioned. Shigaraki Tomura, successor to All for One, was consolidating the League of Villains into something larger and more coordinated than the scattered opportunists who had attacked the training camp. Intelligence reports filtered down through UA's faculty in careful, redacted pieces, enough to make clear that the peaceful interlude Izuku and Yayorozu had just found their footing in was borrowed time rather than a settled state. Izuku absorbed the briefings the way he absorbed everything, methodically, notebook open, cataloging threat profiles and known quirks with the same discipline he had once reserved for admiring heroes from a distance. The difference now was that Yayorozu sat beside him during those sessions, close enough that their shoulders touched, occasionally reaching over to correct a detail in his notes or add an observation of her own that he had missed, and the quiet partnership of it steadied him in a way solitary study never had. "You're doing the thing again," she told him one evening, a full 3 hours into a study session that had drifted from support item design theory into an unplanned deep dive on Shigaraki's decay quirk mechanics. "Where you disappear into your own head and forget the rest of the room exists." "Sorry," Izuku said, blinking back to the present, faintly sheepish. "It's just, the reports say his range and control have both improved since the incident at the plaza a few years back. If that trend continues, whatever we eventually face won't look anything like the villain who nearly killed Ectoplasm's clones back at USJ." "I know," Yayorozu said, quieter now, some of her own composure fraying at the edges. "I read the same reports. I just don't want every evening we have together to become another study session about the worst thing that might happen to us." Izuku closed the notebook at that, chastened, and reached for her hand instead, lacing their fingers together on the tabletop between scattered papers. "You're right. I'm sorry. I keep telling myself that if I understand the threat well enough, I can protect everyone from it, but that's not actually how any of this works, is it?" "No," Yayorozu agreed, softening, squeezing his hand. "It isn't. But I love that you try anyway." It was the first time either of them had used that word, offered so simply and without ceremony that its full weight did not land until several seconds after she had said it, and Izuku felt something in his chest expand past the point of containing it. "I love you too," he said, a little unsteadily, a little amazed at how natural the sentence felt once it was finally spoken aloud. "I think I have for a while. I just didn't have a name specific enough for it until right now." Yayorozu's answering smile was the softest he had ever seen on her, unguarded in a way she rarely allowed herself to be even with him, and for a little while longer that evening, the looming shadow of Shigaraki and everything his rising power promised for the future felt distant enough to set aside. Two people at a table full of half-finished notes, choosing, deliberately, to hold on to something good while they still had the chance. The path ahead of them was not going to be simple. Izuku knew that with the same certainty that had once told him a quirkless boy could still become a hero, and he suspected, watching Yayorozu gather the scattered study materials with steady, competent hands, that she knew it too. There would be more battles, harder ones, before the world settled into whatever peace waited on the other side of the war that was clearly coming. But for the first time since he had glimpsed a stranger helping proctors gather fallen papers on exam day, Izuku understood exactly what he was fighting for, beyond the abstract dream of heroism that had carried him this far. He was fighting for a future where he and Yayarozau Momo got to grow old together, ordinary and unremarkable in all the ways that mattered most, and he intended to survive whatever came next to make sure that future arrived. Chapter 10. Second term brought the Provisional Hero License Exam, a nationwide gauntlet designed to weed out students who could not yet be trusted with limited field authority, and Izuku threw himself into preparation with the same intensity that had once carried him through 10 months of physical training before he could even control the power in his own body. Yayarozau studied beside him more often than not, their sessions splitting time between quirk theory and quieter conversations about the kind of heroes they each wanted to become, and Izuku found that the closer they grew, the sharper his own sense of purpose became, as if having something worth protecting had finally given his ambition a fixed point to orbit. The exam itself unfolded across a full day of grueling trials, a written portion that tested legal knowledge and situational judgment, followed by a practical gauntlet designed to simulate disaster response under artificial time pressure. Izuku's trial paired him unexpectedly with Tokoyami and a support course upperclassman he barely knew, forcing him to coordinate with near strangers under a collapsing structure scenario that tested improvisation as much as raw ability. He passed, exhausted and bruised, and spent the anxious hour before results were posted searching the crowd for a familiar dark ponytail. He found Yayarozau already searching for him, and the relief on both their faces when they confirmed, simultaneously, that they had each passed, dissolved into an embrace right there in the crowded assembly hall, drawing a few good-natured cheers from nearby classmates who had grown thoroughly used to their relationship by now. "I was worried about your trial," Yayarozau admitted into his shoulder, still catching her breath from the embrace. "The reports said your group's structural failure scenario ran longer than most." "I was worried about yours too," Izuku said. "The chemical containment simulation sounded brutal." "It was," she said, pulling back enough to look at him properly, something proud and pleased warming her expression despite the exhaustion. "But we're both licensed now. Provisionally, at least. That has to count for something." It counted for a great deal, in practice, unlocking a wider range of field authority during their ongoing internships and work-study placements, and Izuku found himself, in the months that followed, taking on responsibilities that would have seemed impossible to the notebook-filling boy who had once watched heroes from a rooftop with no expectation of ever joining their ranks. He assisted in a multi-agency flood response that tested his stamina past anything the sports festival had demanded. He helped stabilize a chemical spill alongside professional heroes twice his age who treated him, for the first time, as a colleague rather than a student observer. Each new trial sharpened him, and each evening afterward, Yayarozau was there to hear about it, offering the kind of steady, engaged attention that made even the hardest days feel worth recounting. Their relationship, through all of it, grew the way good things tend to when given room and honesty, unhurried, deepened by shared hardship rather than performative gestures, built on the same foundation of mutual competence and mutual care that had first drawn them together in a chaotic alleyway on exam day. Izuku learned the specific rhythm of Yayarozau's moods, the way she grew quiet rather than loud when overwhelmed, the way she needed a few minutes of silence before she was ready to talk through a problem rather than being pushed toward an immediate solution. Yayarozau, in turn, learned to recognize the particular tension in Izuku's shoulders that meant he was spiraling into self-doubt, and developed a gentle, direct way of interrupting that spiral before it could take hold, usually with nothing more than a hand on his arm and a quiet reminder that he did not have to carry every burden alone. Their classmates, watching the relationship steady into something clearly built to last, stopped treating it as a novelty and started treating it as simply one more fixed feature of Class 1A's landscape, no more remarkable than Ida's punctuality or Uraraka's optimism. It was Tsuyu, characteristically blunt, who put words to the general consensus one lunch period, watching Izuku automatically save a seat beside his own for Yayarozau before she had even entered the cafeteria. "You two are going to get married someday, ribbit," she said, not as a joke exactly, more as a simple observation of fact, and the rest of the table's laughter did nothing to dim the small, private smile that crossed both Izuku's and Yayarozau's faces at the suggestion, neither of them quite ready to say out loud how little the idea startled them. Chapter 11. The final weeks of the term brought a wave of unsettling news that made even the most optimistic members of Class 1A go quiet during faculty briefings. The League of Villains, now operating under Shigaraki's increasingly organized command and reportedly bolstered by resources and knowledge passed down from All for One himself, had begun probing the defenses of multiple hero agencies across the country, testing response times, testing weaknesses, clearly building towards something larger than any single strike the League had attempted before. Aizawa delivered the briefing with his usual flat, exhausted honesty, making no attempt to soften the implication that whatever was coming would likely involve every student currently sitting in that classroom before it was finished. Izuku listened with the same focused intensity he brought to every threat assessment, and found, when the briefing ended and the class filed out into the hallway in uneasy clusters of hushed conversation, that Yayorozu had fallen into step beside him without either of them needing to arrange it, her hand finding his without either of them commenting on the gesture. "Are you scared?" she asked quietly, once they had put enough distance between themselves and the rest of the class to speak freely. Yes, Izuku admitted, because pretending otherwise had never worked between them and he saw no reason to start now. "Not of fighting. I've made peace with that part a long time ago. I'm scared of what it might cost, and who it might cost it from." Yayorozu's grip on his hand tightened slightly, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, simply walking together through the quiet corridor with the weight of an uncertain future settling over both of them in equal measure. "Whatever happens," she said eventually, "I want you to know that none of this, everything we've built together this year, none of it has been a distraction from becoming who I'm meant to become. It's been the reason I understand what I'm fighting for in the first place." "I feel the same way," Izuku said, stopping in the corridor to face her fully, framed by afternoon light slanting through the tall windows. "I used to think being a hero meant saving people I'd never meet, in some abstract, faceless way. I still believe that matters. But somewhere along the way, it also became about protecting this. About protecting you, and everyone else who's become part of my life here. That's not a smaller reason to fight. I think it might be the realest one I've ever had." Yayorozu reached up and brushed her fingers along his jaw, a small, tender gesture that had become familiar over months together and had lost none of its quiet significance, and Izuku leaned into the touch, letting himself, for just a moment, set aside the looming weight of everything the coming months would demand of them both. "Then let's face it together," she said. "Whatever it turns out to be." "Together," Izuku agreed, and the word settled between them like a promise neither intended to break, a small, steady anchor against the uncertain tide of a war that both of them could feel gathering on the horizon, closer now than either wanted to admit, but not close enough yet to steal the fragile, hard-won peace of an ordinary afternoon spent walking hand in hand through a school hallway that had, somehow, over the course of one remarkable year, become the closest thing to home that either of them had ever built for themselves outside their own families. Whatever Shigaraki was building toward, whatever All for One's shadow still hanging over the world's peace ultimately demanded of the heroes rising to meet it, Izuku Midoriya intended to survive it standing beside the woman who had first caught his attention gathering fallen papers at a testing gate, and to keep standing beside her for every year that came after. Chapter 12. Winter break offered a brief, welcome reprieve from the mounting tension, and Izuku spent part of it exactly where he had spent every winter break of his childhood, in the small apartment he shared with his mother, filling the days with quiet routines that felt almost surreal in their ordinariness after a year of villain attacks and life-altering training. Inko fussed over him the way she always had, feeding him twice as much as he could reasonably eat and asking careful, hopeful questions about his classmates that circled, with increasing directness as the days passed, toward one classmate in particular. "You talk about Yayorozu-san a great deal," she observed one evening, setting down a plate of katsudon with the studied casualness of someone who had been building up to the comment for days. "More than you talk about anyone else, even Uraraka-chan and Ida-kun." Izuku, caught mid-bite, felt his ears go warm. We're together, actually. Dating. I probably should have told you sooner, I just wasn't sure how to bring it up." Inko's reaction was immediate and entirely unrestrained, a burst of delighted tears that had become something of a family tradition at this point, followed by an insistence, gentle but immovable, that he invite Yayorozu to visit before the break ended so that his mother could finally meet the girl who had, by every account Izuku had inadvertently given over the past year, become so important to him. The visit, when it happened a few days later, went better than Izuku had allowed himself to hope. Yayarozau arrived with a gift for Inko that was thoughtful without being extravagant, a small potted plant chosen, she explained, because Izuku had once mentioned in passing that his mother enjoyed gardening on their cramped apartment balcony, and Inko's delighted surprise at the small, remembered kindness set the tone for the rest of the afternoon. The two women fell into easy conversation over tea, Inko peppering Yayarozau with the kind of gently probing questions mothers reserved for anyone important enough to their children to warrant scrutiny, and Yayarozau answering each one with a warmth and patience that made Izuku's chest ache with something dangerously close to certainty about the shape of his own future. "She's wonderful," Inko told him privately in the kitchen, ostensibly helping refill the tea while Yayarozau waited politely in the next room. "I can see how much she cares about you, Izuku. It's in the way she watches you when she thinks no one's looking." "Your father," she stopped herself, a familiar shadow crossing her expression at the mention of the husband who had chosen distance over presence years ago, and then pushed through it with visible resolve. "Your father never looked at me the way she looks at you. Don't let that kind of thing go, whatever happens. Promise me." "I don't intend to," Izuku said quietly, and meant it with the full weight of everything the coming year threatened to demand of him. The break ended too quickly, as breaks always did, and the return to UA brought with it renewed briefings, renewed tension, and the unmistakable sense that whatever timeline the League of Villains was operating on, it was accelerating. Faculty meetings grew longer and more closed-door. Patrol assignments for licensed students grew more frequent, pulling Class 1A further into the actual machinery of active hero work rather than the supervised simulations that had defined their first year. Izuku found himself, more nights than not, lying awake running threat scenarios in his head long after Yayarozau had fallen asleep beside him during their increasingly frequent study sessions that stretched past curfew, until she would stir, half-conscious, and murmur some gentle admonishment about overworking himself before pulling him back down into the quiet, steadying comfort of simply being near each other. He did not know yet, in those late winter weeks, the exact shape of the trial that was building toward them, the full scope of what Shigaraki's growing coalition intended or how many more allies and enemies would enter their lives before the conflict finally broke open into the kind of war the whole hero world had been dreading since All for One's name first resurfaced. He knew only that whatever came, he would not face it as the isolated, quirkless boy who had once filled notebooks alone in his childhood bedroom, dreaming of a heroism he was told he could never touch. He would face it as part of something larger, a class of allies who had become family, a mentor's legacy he intended to honor, and, closest of all, a partner whose hand he could reach for in the dark and find already reaching back. Whatever battles lay ahead on the road toward the peace they both wanted badly enough to fight for, Izuku Midoriya intended to walk that road all the way to its end, and to build, on the other side of it, the ordinary, extraordinary life he had quietly promised himself and Yayarozau Momo they would earn together. Chapter 13. The first real sign that the calm was ending arrived on a gray afternoon in early spring, when Aizawa called an unscheduled assembly of every second-year Hero Course student, faculty lined up along the front of the auditorium with an expression Izuku had learned, over the past year, to recognize as genuinely grave rather than merely cautious. Nizu delivered the briefing himself, a rare enough occurrence that the room fell silent before he had said a single word. Multiple League of Villains cells had been tracked converging toward a set of coordinated targets, the principal explained, his usually cheerful tone flattened into something more serious. All for One's continued influence over Shigaraki's strategy suggested this was no longer a matter of isolated skirmishes but the opening movement of a larger, sustained campaign, one that UA and the wider hero community needed to prepare for as an inevitability rather than a possibility. Provisional license holders, Nizu continued, would be integrated more directly into home defense and evacuation protocols going forward, a decision made with visible reluctance but with no better alternative available given the scale of what intelligence suggested was coming. Izuku absorbed the briefing with the same disciplined focus he brought to every threat, but beneath the surface calm, something colder and more personal had settled into his chest, a recognition that the war he had been quietly dreading since childhood, the one that would decide, ultimately, whether the peace his generation inherited would hold or shatter, was no longer a distant certainty. It was arriving, and soon, and every person he loved most in the world was standing directly in its path alongside him. He found Yayarozau after the assembly ended, the two of them retreating to a quiet stairwell away from the anxious buzz of their classmates processing the news, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply holding on to each other in the narrow, echoing space, drawing whatever steadiness they could from the simple fact of the other's presence. "We're going to get through this," Izuku said finally, voice quiet but certain, more a promise than a prediction. "Whatever it turns out to be. However bad it gets before it gets better. We're going to get through it, together, and on the other side of it, we're going to have the life we've been building toward this whole time." Yayorozu pulled back just enough to look at him, her own composure visibly steadying itself around the anchor of his certainty, and nodded once, firm and resolute in the way that had first drawn his attention across a chaotic exam ground more than a year ago now. "Together," she echoed, the same word they had traded like a vow once before, and this time it carried the full weight of everything still ahead of them, the coming war, the uncertain cost of it, and, waiting patiently on the far side of whatever trials remained, the future they both intended to survive long enough to claim. Chapter 11. The attack came 11 days after Nizu's briefing, not against UA itself but against a downtown relief operation where a dozen provisional license holders, Izuku, and Yayorozu among them, had been deployed to assist professional heroes managing a gas leak evacuation. It began the way these things always seemed to begin, with an ordinary afternoon fracturing in an instant, a warp gate splitting open above the evacuation perimeter and disgorging 6 League operatives Izuku did not recognize from any prior briefing, their coordination too clean, too rehearsed, to be anything but deliberate. "They're not here for the leak," Yayorozu said immediately, already scanning the scattering crowd for the actual target, her analytical instincts as sharp under pressure as they had always been. "This is a diversion." Someone wanted a crowd of civilians and pros stretched thin in the same place at the same time. She was right, as she so often was, and the confirmation arrived seconds later when a seventh figure descended through the same gate with considerably less fanfare than his subordinates, moving with the eerie stillness of someone entirely confident in his own danger. Izuku recognized the decay-scarred hands even before Aizawa's voice crackled urgently over the comms, confirming what his gut had already told him. Shigaraki had come himself, and he had come for Endeavor, whose agency had jurisdiction over this district and who arrived at a dead sprint the moment the alert reached him, flames roaring to life around both fists. Izuku had trained for this scenario in the abstract 100 times, had studied Shigaraki's decay quirk and its terrifying 5-fingered range until the mechanics were second nature, but nothing in that preparation matched the visceral rawness of watching the man himself move through the chaos with casual, contemptuous efficiency, decaying a support pillar to dust with an idle brush of his fingers as though it were an afterthought rather than an act of violence. "Civilians first," Izuku called to Yayorozu, already moving, full cowling crackling green across his limbs. "We can't engage him directly, not without backup, we need to clear the block and buy Endeavor room to work." She was already producing barriers, reinforced steel plating solidifying between fleeing civilians and the worst of the collateral damage radiating from Endeavor's escalating exchange with Shigaraki, her concentration absolute even as sweat beaded along her hairline from the sheer volume of mass conversion the moment demanded. Izuku worked the evacuation route beside her, hauling a trapped shopkeeper free of a collapsing awning, redirecting a stampeding cluster of office workers away from a side street where 2 League operatives had cut off the obvious escape path. It was in that side street that things went wrong. One of the operatives, a lean woman with a quirk that let her liquefy short stretches of pavement, dropped the ground out from beneath Izuku mid-stride, and he fell hard, disoriented, directly into the path of the second operative's incoming strike. He twisted at the last second, absorbing the blow across his shoulder rather than his skull, and came up already moving, full cowling burning through his remaining reserves faster than he wanted, aware with growing alarm that he had let himself get separated from Yayorozu in the scramble. He found her again moments later locked in her own confrontation, cornered by the pavement-melting woman while a length of solidifying steel restraint she had half-formed lay useless in her trembling hands, clearly overtaxed from the earlier barrier work. Izuku closed the distance at a full sprint, full cowling driving him faster than his body wanted to move, and put himself bodily between Yayorozu and the incoming attack a half-second before it would have landed. The blow that caught him instead sent him skidding across broken pavement, breath driven entirely from his lungs, but it also gave Yayorozu the half-second of breathing room she needed to finish the restraint she had started, steel cable snapping taut around the operative's ankles and dropping her flat. "Izuku!" Yayarozau was at his side before the operative had even finished falling, hands running urgently over his ribs, checking for the worst even as he waved her off, forcing himself upright through the ringing in his skull. I'm fine, we need to keep moving, they're still. The rest of the sentence died in his throat as a shockwave rolled through the district, Endeavor's flames flaring to a blinding intensity somewhere behind them, and both of them turned in time to see Shigaraki retreat through a hastily opened warp gate. The confrontation apparently concluded on terms the League had chosen rather than terms Endeavor had won. It was not a defeat, not exactly, but it was not a victory either, and the ambiguity of it sat heavily over the entire relief operation as emergency services finally began flooding into the cleared district in the confrontation's aftermath. Izuku sat against a cracked storefront afterward, Yayarozau beside him, both of them bruised and shaking with adrenaline crash, and understood with sudden, cold clarity that the war Nizu had warned them about was no longer a matter of preparation. It had already begun, quietly, in probing skirmishes like this one, and it would only escalate from here. Chapter 12. The debrief that followed lasted 3 hours, faculty and professional heroes alike combing through every second of footage from the encounter, and Izuku emerged from it more exhausted than the fight itself had left him, his mind churning through everything he could have done differently. Every second he might have shaved off his response time, every civilian who had come closer to harm than he could bear to think about. Yayarozau found him afterward in the dormitory common room, staring at a mug of tea gone cold in his hands, and settled beside him without a word, simply present in the way she had learned mattered most during his worst spirals. You're replaying it, she said eventually, not a question. I got separated from you, Izuku said, voice tight. I let myself get isolated in that side street. And if that operative had been faster, if I'd been a half-second slower reaching you. But you weren't, Yayarozau said, firm, cutting through the spiral before it could fully take hold. You reached me in time. We both made it through. Izuku, look at me. He did, reluctantly, and found her expression steady and unflinching, refusing to let him disappear into the catastrophe that had not happened. This is what the job is. This is what we signed up for, both of us, with our eyes open. We are going to have days like today. We cannot let every one of them convince us we're failing simply because the danger was real. I know that, Izuku said, quieter now, some of the tension draining out of his shoulders under the weight of her certainty. I just don't know how to stop being afraid of losing you in a moment I can't control. You don't stop being afraid, Yayarozau said, taking the cold mug from his hands and setting it aside so she could hold both of his instead. You just decide the fear doesn't get to make your choices for you. I'm afraid too, every single time. I was afraid today. I'm still afraid right now, if I'm honest. But I would rather be afraid and standing beside you than safe and standing anywhere else. It was, Izuku thought, exactly the kind of thing that made loving her feel less like a vulnerability and more like the sturdiest ground he had ever stood on, and he pulled her into a proper embrace, breathing in the familiar, steadying scent of her hair, letting the last of the day's adrenaline finally bleed out of him in the quiet safety of the dormitory common room. The League's opening skirmish, as faculty came to call it in subsequent briefings, marked a clear turning point in how UA approached its remaining second-year students. Field deployments increased in frequency and stakes. Combat training intensified, less focused now on tournament-style dueling and more on the kind of coordinated, high-pressure teamwork that real engagements against organized League cells actually demanded. Izuku and Yayarozau found themselves paired more often in these exercises, faculty having clearly noticed, and chosen to leverage, the seamless coordination the two of them had built over more than a year of fighting alongside each other. They were good together in ways that went beyond simple compatibility, Izuku's improvisational instincts complementing Yayarozau's methodical precision, each of them instinctively covering the other's blind spots without needing to communicate the adjustment aloud. Izawa noted it dryly during one debrief, remarking that their partnership had become efficient enough to reassign other students around it rather than the reverse, and the faint, pleased flush that rose in Yayarozau's cheeks at the rare compliment stayed with Izuku for the rest of that week. Beneath the mounting pressure of an accelerating war, they built, deliberately and with growing urgency, whatever pockets of ordinary life they could still claim for themselves, a shared meal between training sessions, an hour spent reading side by side rather than studying, small unremarkable moments that mattered more now precisely because neither of them could take for granted how many more of them they would get. Izuku had started, without quite admitting it to himself yet, to think in terms of a future on the far side of whatever war was coming, a future he intended to build with Yayorozu at the center of it. He had not said as much to her directly. But the thought had taken root regardless, steady and certain, growing alongside every battle they survived together. Chapter 13. Third year began with a formal reorganization of UA's hero course structure, a response to the escalating threat that folded advanced field authority directly into the curriculum rather than treating it as a supplementary internship track. Izuku found himself assigned, along with a handful of other top-performing students, to a rotating deployment schedule that put him in direct contact with professional agencies on a near-weekly basis, real casework rather than simulation, real consequences for every decision. Yayorozu's own placement landed her increasingly with material science and support development divisions, a natural extension of the reputation her creation quirk had built over 2 years of demonstrated versatility, and though their individual assignments occasionally pulled them in different directions during a given week, they made a point, fierce and deliberate, of protecting the time they did have together, treating it as a resource too precious to squander on anything less than full presence. It was during one of these rare shared evenings, seated together on the dormitory rooftop that had become something like sacred ground between them, that Yayorozu raised a subject Izuku had noticed her circling for weeks without quite landing on directly. "My mother wants to meet you," she said, a little more carefully than her usual directness, watching his reaction closely. "Properly, I mean. Not the brief introduction after last year's sports festival. She's asked twice now, and I've been putting it off, mostly because I know how she can be." "How can she be?" Izuku asked, more curious than alarmed, though something in Yayorozu's careful phrasing put him faintly on guard. "Formal," Yayorozu admitted. "Exacting. My family has certain expectations about presentation, about suitability, for lack of a better word, and I don't want you to feel like you're walking into an interrogation, because you're not, but I also don't want to pretend she won't ask pointed questions." Izuku considered this for a moment, and then, because he had learned over 2 years together that meeting Yayorozu's honesty with anything less than his own honesty in return only ever made things harder, said simply, "I'd like to meet her. If it matters to you, it matters to me, and I'd rather know where I stand with your family honestly than avoid it and wonder." The dinner, when it happened 2 weeks later at the Yayorozu family estate, a sprawling, elegant property that made Izuku acutely aware of the gulf between his own modest upbringing and the world Yayorozu had come from, unfolded with exactly the careful formality Yayorozu had warned him about. Her mother, elegant and precise in a way that made her daughter's own composure suddenly make a great deal more sense, asked pointed questions about his career trajectory, his family background, his intentions, delivered with a politeness that did nothing to soften their weight. Izuku answered each one honestly, without embellishment, describing his quirkless childhood and the long road to one for all without shame, his mother's modest income without apology, his feelings for Yayorozu without hedging. He watched, throughout dinner, the careful evaluation in her mother's eyes gradually shift, question by question, from polite skepticism toward something more like grudging, surprised respect, until finally, over dessert, she set down her fork and regarded him with an expression considerably less guarded than she had worn all evening. "You understand," she said, "that my daughter has never once brought a partner to this table before you. She is exceptionally selective, exceptionally private about matters of the heart. I confess I expected someone more polished. I did not expect someone quite this genuine." "I'll take that as a compliment," Izuku said carefully, and her small, approving smile confirmed that he had read the moment correctly. Yayorozu's hand found his beneath the table afterward, squeezing once, gratefully, and though neither of them said much about the dinner on the drive back to the dormitories, the quiet, contented silence between them said everything that needed saying. Whatever else the coming war demanded of them, Izuku thought, watching the city lights slide past the car window with Yayorozu's head resting against his shoulder, he had just cleared one more hurdle on the long, deliberate road toward the future he intended to build with her, and he found himself, for the first time, allowing that future to take a more concrete shape in his mind than he had ever let it before. Chapter 14. The second major league engagement arrived without warning on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, striking not at a relief operation this time but at UA itself, a coordinated infiltration attempt that tested the school's defenses more seriously than any assault since the USJ incident 2 years prior. Izuku was in the middle of an advanced tactics seminar when the alarm cut through the building, Aizawa's voice crackling over the emergency channel with clipped, urgent instructions that sent every student in the room moving before the sentence had even finished. The attackers, it became clear within minutes, were not League regulars but a newer cell, unfamiliar quirks and unfamiliar tactics suggesting Shigaraki's coalition had continued absorbing outside talent in the months since the downtown skirmish. Izuku found Yayarozau at the rally point exactly where protocol dictated, already producing defensive barricades to funnel the intruders away from the underclassmen dormitories, and fell into position beside her without needing instruction. 2 years of practiced partnership taking over where explicit communication would only have wasted time. 3 intruders breached the east perimeter, she reported, already moving. Aizawa and Present Mike are engaging the main force at the front gate. We're the last line before the dorms. They held that line together for what felt like considerably longer than the 11 minutes the official incident report would later confirm, Izuku's full cowling driving back 2 of the 3 intruders while Yayarozau's rapidly improvised restraints handled the third, a wiry, unpredictable young man whose quirk let him phase partway through solid matter and made conventional restraint nearly impossible until Yayarozau, thinking fast under pressure, produced a containment field of dense, layered material specifically engineered to counter exactly that kind of partial intangibility. Where did you even learn to counter a phasing quirk that fast? Izuku asked afterward, breathless, once backup had finally arrived to secure the restrained intruders. I didn't, Yayarozau admitted, still catching her breath herself. I improvised the density calculations in real time. I've been running theoretical counters to unusual quirk types in my head for months, just in case. I suppose today proved it was worth the effort. It was, Izuku thought, watching her direct the arriving support staff with the same calm competence she brought to every crisis, one more small piece of evidence for a conclusion he had been building toward for longer than he wanted to admit, that whatever war finally arrived to test them both completely, he could not imagine facing it with anyone else standing beside him. The thought settled into him with a quiet, unshakable certainty that had nothing dramatic about it and everything permanent. The kind of realization that did not announce itself so much as confirm something he had already, on some deeper level, decided a long time ago. The infiltration attempt was repelled without serious casualties, though the incident forced yet another round of security overhauls and yet another sobering faculty briefing about the accelerating pace of League activity. Nizu's closing remarks that evening carried a weight Izuku had not heard from the principal before, a rare admission that the timeline the hero community had once hoped for, years of gradual preparation before any decisive confrontation, had almost certainly compressed into something far shorter. We are not looking at years anymore, Nizu said quietly, addressing the assembled students with none of his usual theatrical cheer. We are looking, I believe, at months. I would rather tell you that plainly now than have you discover it unprepared later. Use the time you have left well. Izuku left that briefing with Yayarozau's hand tightly wound in his own, both of them silent on the walk back to the dormitories, and it was there, in that silence, under a sky just beginning to darken toward evening, that a decision Izuku had been circling for weeks finally crystallized into something he knew, with total certainty, he wanted to act on before whatever was coming arrived to test them both beyond anything they had faced so far. He did not say anything about it that night. But he began, quietly and with the same methodical care he brought to every important project, to plan. Chapter 15. Izuku spent the better part of a month on preparations he kept carefully hidden from everyone except his mother, whose blessing he sought first, and Yayarozau's own mother, whose formal approval he understood, from 2 years of watching how carefully that family weighed such things, would matter more to Yayarozau than she might ever admit outright. Both conversations left him more nervous than facing any villain had, and both ended, to his profound relief, with warm, unhesitating support. She's going to say yes, his mother told him, wiping her eyes for what felt like the 100th time that year, but Izuku, promise me you'll actually ask properly. Not in the middle of a crisis, not rushed. She deserves a moment she can hold on to. He took the advice to heart, choosing a quiet Sunday when both of their deployment schedules aligned for a rare full day off, and brought Yayarozau to a small overlook on the outskirts of the city where the two of them had once ended up by accident during a training exercise their first year, a place with no particular significance to anyone else but a great deal to them, the exact spot where they had first admitted, half joking and wholly serious, that they could see themselves still knowing each other decades from now. Yayarozau, sharp as ever, seemed to sense something different about the day almost immediately, watching him with a faint, curious attentiveness that only deepened as the afternoon wore on and Izuku grew steadily more obviously nervous despite his best efforts to hide it. "You're doing the thing," she said eventually, echoing words she had said to him more than once before, though her voice held a gentler, more searching quality than usual. "Where you disappear into your own head. Is something wrong?" "No," Izuku said, and then, because there was no version of this moment that benefited from further delay, took a steadying breath and turned to face her fully, the overlook's late afternoon light catching gold in her dark hair exactly the way he remembered from that first accidental visit. "Momo, I've known since an alley on our entrance exam that you were someone I wanted in my life. I didn't have a name for it then. I have one now, and I've had it for a long time, and I don't want to spend one more day pretending I don't know exactly what I want, especially not with everything the world keeps reminding us we can't take for granted." Her breath caught audibly as he lowered himself onto one knee, producing the ring he had spent weeks agonizing over, a modest, elegant piece he had commissioned specifically rather than ask her to fabricate for herself, wanting this one thing, at least, to come entirely from him. "Will you marry me?" he asked, voice steadier than he felt, heart hammering loud enough he was half certain she could hear it. Yayarozau's answer arrived not in words at first but in the sudden, overwhelmed press of both hands over her mouth, tears spilling freely down her face, and for one heart-stopping second Izuku feared he had somehow misjudged everything. Then she was pulling him up and into her arms with a fierce, unrestrained joy that answered the question more thoroughly than any single word could have. "Yes," she managed finally, laughing and crying at once, forehead pressed to his. "Yes, obviously yes, Izuku, of course it's yes." They stayed at the overlook long past sunset, the ring catching the last light before darkness finally settled over the city, and Izuku thought, holding his now fiancé in the fading warmth of that ordinary, extraordinary afternoon, that whatever trials still waited for them on the road ahead, he had just secured the one thing he refused to let any war take from him without a fight. Chapter 16. News of the engagement moved through Class 1A with predictable speed once they returned to the dormitories, Uraraka bursting into tears of pure delight the moment Yayarozau showed her the ring, Mina immediately demanding to help plan an engagement celebration, Ida delivering another characteristically lengthy speech about the significance of lifelong commitment that had the whole common room laughing before he finished. Even Bakugo, gruff as ever, managed something that passed for genuine warmth, clapping Izuku on the shoulder hard enough to sting and muttering a congratulations that everyone present understood to be entirely sincere beneath the customary rough edges. Aizawa's reaction, delivered the following morning with characteristic dryness, consisted of a single raised eyebrow and the observation that he expected both of their combat performance ratings to remain unaffected by whatever domestic distractions had entered their lives, a comment that made Yayarozau flush and Izuku stammer through an assurance that training would remain their full priority, which only made their homeroom teacher's eyebrow climb marginally higher before he moved on without further comment. The celebration, when Mina finally organized it a week later, filled the dormitory common room with the entire class, decorations improvised from support course materials and a cake Sato had spent an entire evening perfecting, and Izuku found himself, sitting in the middle of that warm chaos with Yayarozau's hand in his, more grateful than he had words for the family this school had become for both of them, quite apart from the families either had been born into. "I told you," Tsuyu said, settling beside them with a knowing look, back before either of you would admit it out loud. "Ribbit. You did," Izuku admitted, laughing. "I should have believed you sooner." Beneath the celebration's warmth, though, the shadow of the accelerating war never fully receded, and faculty briefings in the weeks that followed carried increasingly urgent undertones, intelligence suggesting Shigaraki's coalition was finalizing preparations for something considerably larger than the probing skirmishes the hero community had weathered so far. Izuku absorbed each briefing with the same disciplined focus as always, but found now that his motivation had sharpened into something even more personal than before. He was no longer simply fighting for an abstract vision of peace, or even solely for the found family of Class 1A. He was fighting, now, for a wedding he fully intended to have the chance to celebrate, for a life with Yayorozu that he refused to let any villain, however powerful, take from him before he'd had the chance to build it. Yayorozu seemed to carry the same sharpened resolve, training with an intensity that pushed even her considerable discipline further than before, refining her creation quirk's combat applications with a focus that left Izuku in quiet awe more than once, watching her produce increasingly sophisticated countermeasures during sparring sessions with a speed that would have seemed impossible even a year earlier. "I want to be strong enough that neither of us has to be afraid for the other," she told him one evening, breathless from an exhausting solo training session he had found her still running long after most of the dormitory had gone quiet for the night. "I know that's not entirely realistic. I know fear is simply part of this life we've chosen. But I want to give us the best possible chance, whatever's coming. We'll face it together," Izuku said, the same promise they had made to each other more than once now, each repetition carrying more weight than the last. "Whatever it turns out to be." He meant it with everything he had, and as the weeks wore on, as intelligence briefings grew more urgent and faculty preparations more intensive, that promise became the steady center both of them returned to, again and again, the one certainty neither the war nor its uncertain cost could take from them. Whatever trial still waited on the horizon, they would meet it standing together, and on the far side of it, they intended to claim the life and the wedding and the ordinary, extraordinary future that a chaotic entrance exam alley had first set them on the path toward, 2 years and a lifetime of shared battles ago. Chapter 17. Graduation preparations arrived alongside the mounting military tempo of UA's final months, an odd juxtaposition that Izuku found himself thinking about often, the ordinary rituals of finishing school, choosing agencies, planning a future, unfolding in the same breath as increasingly grim intelligence briefings about a war that showed every sign of arriving before that future could properly begin. Career counseling sessions that should have been straightforward, in an ordinary year, carried an unspoken subtext now, every faculty advisor aware that the placements they discussed might be interrupted before the students in question ever fully settled into them. Izuku's own offer sheet, when it finally arrived, was thick with agency names, the accumulated result of 3 years spent proving, battle after battle, that the quirkless boy who had once seemed an impossible fit for hero work had become one of his generation's most capable young heroes. He chose, in the end, a placement that would keep him close to the city's ongoing defense preparations rather than a flashier assignment elsewhere, a decision Yayorozu understood without needing explanation, since her own choice, when it came, followed the identical logic. An agency with deep ties to UA's faculty network, positioned to respond quickly to whatever the League's coalition finally launched. "We're choosing to stay close to the fight," she observed one evening, reviewing both of their contracts side by side at the small desk in Izuku's dorm room, papers spread between them. "Neither of us is choosing safety. Would you want to?" Izuku asked, genuinely curious, though he already suspected the answer. "No," Yayorozu said simply, without hesitation. "I want to be where I can do the most good, and right now, that's here." But I wanted to say it plainly, at least once, so that neither of us pretends we didn't choose this with our eyes open. It was, Izuku thought, exactly the kind of clear-eyed honesty that had first drawn him to her, and he found himself, not for the first time, grateful beyond measure that whatever the coming months demanded of them, he would not face it with a partner who needed the truth softened. The wedding planning, modest as their schedules allowed it to be, unfolded in stolen fragments between training sessions and deployments, a venue chosen during a rare shared lunch break, a guest list debated over late-night tea, a dress Yayorozu's mother insisted on commissioning from a family friend despite her daughter's protests that anything simple would suffice. Neither of them set a firm date. Both understood, without needing to discuss it directly, that the date would depend entirely on what the coming war allowed. And there was a particular kind of quiet grief in that unspoken understanding, a wedding held provisionally at bay by forces neither of them could control, waiting for a ceasefire that might not arrive on any timeline they could plan around. "I don't want to wait for perfect circumstances," Yayorozu admitted one night, curled against his side in the quiet dark of his dorm room, voice smaller than her usual composed register. "I keep thinking, What if we wait for the war to end and it simply doesn't end, not cleanly, not in a way that leaves room for a wedding at all? Then we'll have a small one, Izuku said, holding her a little tighter. The moment there's a window, however brief. I don't need the venue your mother's planning or the guest list we've been debating. I just need you, and enough people who matter to witness it. Everything else is decoration. Yayarozau was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke again, her voice had steadied, some of its usual certainty returning. I'd like that. A small ceremony, whenever the war gives us the chance, rather than waiting for some idealized moment that might never come. They fell asleep that night with the matter settled between them, one more small certainty to hold on to amid the mounting uncertainty of everything else, and Izuku found, in the weeks that followed, that the simple clarity of that decision made the accelerating tempo of war preparations somehow easier to bear. He no longer needed the war to end cleanly before he could imagine his future. He simply needed to survive it, and to make sure Yayarozau survived it beside him, and everything else, he had decided, could be built from whatever small window of peace they managed to claim together. Chapter 18. The intelligence that finally confirmed the League's timeline arrived 3 weeks before graduation, delivered in a closed-door faculty session that Izuku and a handful of other top students were summoned to attend directly rather than receiving second-hand through the usual briefing channels, a break from protocol significant enough that everyone in the room understood, before a word was spoken, that whatever followed would be serious. Niza did not soften the delivery. All for One's remaining network, largely dormant since his imprisonment years earlier, had been fully reactivated under Shigaraki's command, resources, and knowledge and, more alarmingly, a scattering of quirk-altering research that intelligence suggested had produced a new generation of significantly enhanced League operatives. The coalition's stated goal, gleaned from intercepted communications, was nothing less than a direct, decisive strike against the hero system's command structure itself, a strategy designed not merely to cause damage but to permanently cripple the infrastructure that made organized heroism possible. We believe the strike will come within the next several months, Nizu said, his usual cheerful demeanor entirely absent. Possibly sooner. We do not yet have precise targeting, though our analysis suggests population centers with high concentrations of ranked pro-heroes are the most likely focus. I am telling you this directly, rather than through the standard briefing structure, because each of you will very likely be called upon to fight in whatever this becomes, and I believe you deserve to prepare for that reality with full information rather than filtered reassurance. The room absorbed this in heavy silence, and Izuku felt Yayarozau's hand find his beneath the briefing table, gripping tightly, both of them processing the same cold certainty settling over the gathered students. Whatever war had been quietly building for the better part of 2 years was now, finally, approaching its breaking point, and neither of them could say with any confidence how much longer the fragile, hard-won peace they had built their lives around would hold. They left the briefing together, walking in silence through darkened UA corridors long after most of the campus had gone quiet for the night, until Yayarozau finally stopped them both at a familiar stairwell landing, the same quiet space where they had once processed an earlier, smaller version of this same dread. I'm not afraid of the fight itself, she said, facing him fully, voice steady despite the visible strain beneath it. I've made my peace with that, the same way you told me you had, a long time ago now. What I'm afraid of is everything after, if the worst happens. I'm afraid of a future where I have to learn how to be a hero without you beside me, or where you have to learn the same thing without me. Then we make sure that's not the future we get, Izuku said, pulling her into his arms, holding on with the same fierce, deliberate certainty he had carried since a chaotic exam day Ali first introduced them to each other. I know I can't promise you nothing will go wrong. I know that's not a promise either of us can honestly make, in this line of work. But I can promise you I will fight for that future with everything I have, every single time it's tested, and I believe you'll do the same. That has to be enough to hold on to, because it's what we've got. Yayarozau nodded against his shoulder, steadying herself against his certainty the way she so often did, the way he had learned to steady himself against hers in turn. It's enough, she said finally. It has to be. They stood together in that stairwell for a long while afterward, two people who had built, over 3 remarkable years, a partnership strong enough to weather villains and doubt and the mounting dread of an approaching war, and when they finally parted for the night, it was with the unspoken understanding that whatever the coming months held, They would face every moment of it exactly the way they had faced everything else since a rope-tangled alley first brought them together, side by side. And with no intention of letting go. Chapter 19. Graduation arrived under a sky so ordinary and blue that Izuku found the sight of it almost disorienting, given everything the faculty briefings had spent the preceding weeks warning them to prepare for. Class 1A filed across the ceremony stage in the same uniforms they had worn on countless training exercises, transformed now, however briefly, into something closer to formal dress, and Izuku found himself, waiting his turn in line, scanning the assembled crowd of families until he found his mother, already crying, seated beside Yayorozu's own composed but visibly emotional parents. Nizu's address to the graduating class ran shorter than tradition usually demanded, a deliberate choice, Izuku suspected, given the weight the principal clearly felt every additional minute carried in the current climate. He spoke of resilience, of the particular courage this class had demonstrated across 3 years of escalating danger, and closed with words that Izuku would carry with him long after the ceremony ended. You entered this institution as children with extraordinary gifts and uncertain futures, Nizu said, his small, sharp eyes moving across the assembled students with something like genuine pride beneath the gravity. You leave it as heroes, in every sense that matters, regardless of whatever tests still lie ahead. Whatever comes next, I have every confidence you will meet it the way you have met everything so far, together, and without flinching. Izuku crossed the stage when his name was called, accepted his certification with hands that trembled slightly despite his best efforts at composure, and found Yayorozu waiting for her own turn just a few names behind him in the alphabetical order, her eyes bright with unshed tears when their gazes met across the stage. When her own name was finally called and she crossed to accept her certification, poised and radiant in a way that made Izuku's chest ache with pride, the small, private smile she sent his way before returning to her seat felt like its own kind of vow, a promise renewed in front of everyone who mattered most to both of them. The reception afterward filled UA's main courtyard with the particular chaos of proud families and relieved, celebrating graduates, and Izuku found himself pulled in a dozen directions at once, his mother's tearful embrace, Yayorozu's father's firm, approving handshake, Uraraka's enthusiastic hug that nearly knocked him off balance, Bakugo's gruff but genuine congratulations delivered with none of the old hostility that had once defined their rivalry. Through all of it, Yayorozu remained a steady, warm presence at his side, her hand finding his whenever the crowd briefly thinned enough to allow it, and Izuku thought, surveying the courtyard full of found family and blood family alike, that whatever the coming weeks demanded of them, this moment, at least, belonged entirely to the two of them and everyone who had helped them reach it. We did it, Yayorozu said quietly, finding a rare moment of relative privacy with him near the courtyard's edge, watching the celebration continue around them. 3 years, and we actually made it here together. We did, Izuku agreed, pulling her close. And whatever comes next, we're going to make it through that too. She rested her head against his shoulder, and for a little while longer, they simply stood together in the fading afternoon light, holding on to the hard-won ordinary joy of a graduation ceremony neither of them had ever fully let themselves take for granted, aware, without needing to say it aloud, that the reprieve was borrowed time, and that somewhere beyond the courtyard's celebratory noise, the war Nizu had warned them about was drawing steadily, inexorably closer. Chapter 20. The weeks immediately following graduation carried a strange, suspended quality. Both of them settled into their new agency placements, building the early rhythms of professional hero work, while the broader hero community's preparations for the League's anticipated strike continued escalating in the background of every briefing, every patrol assignment, every quiet conversation between colleagues who had all absorbed the same grim intelligence. Izuku found the adjustment to full professional responsibility both exhilarating and sobering, no longer operating under the protective structure of student status, his decisions now carrying the full weight of licensed authority and everything that came with it. Yayorozu adapted to her own new placement with characteristic thoroughness, quickly establishing herself as an indispensable resource for her agency's support development division, her creation quirk proving as versatile in professional application as it had throughout her years at UA. They settled, in the small pockets of overlapping free time their respective schedules allowed, into a domestic rhythm neither of them had fully anticipated craving as much as they did, shared meals in the modest apartment they had moved into together shortly after graduation, quiet evenings spent simply existing in each other's company after long, demanding days, small routines that felt, in their unremarkable ordinariness, like a quiet act of defiance against the uncertain future still gathering on the horizon. I could get used to this, Yaoyorozu admitted one evening, curled against him on their small apartment couch, exhaustion from a long day softened by the simple comfort of finally being home. The ordinary parts. I didn't expect to want them this much. Me too, Izuku said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I think that's part of why we're fighting. Not just the big, abstract reasons. This too. All of this. They had not yet set a firm wedding date, both still holding to the earlier agreement to wait for whatever window the escalating tension allowed, but the subject surfaced more often now in their quiet evening conversations, a small, hopeful thread of planning that neither of them wanted to abandon entirely to the uncertainty around them. Yayorozu's mother, with characteristic efficiency, had already begun quietly assembling contingency plans for a ceremony that could be arranged on short notice. Whenever the couple finally gave the word, a preparation Izuku found himself deeply grateful for every time he thought about it. The League's strike, when the first credible warning of its imminent arrival finally reached UA's faculty network and rippled outward to every agency and licensed hero in the affected region, came with less than 48 hours of notice. Intelligence gathered from a deep-cover operative inside the coalition's outer ranks confirming that the long-anticipated assault would begin within the coming days, targeting, as feared, a cluster of major agencies and hero infrastructure across the city. Izuku and Yayorozu now called home. Izuku received the alert during a routine patrol shift, his phone buzzing with an emergency notification that made his stomach drop the moment he read the header, and he found himself, in the following hour, running through every contingency he and Yayorozu had ever discussed, every promise they had made each other about facing whatever came together, with a clarity and urgency that made the abstract dread of the past 2 years suddenly, terrifyingly concrete. He met her at their apartment that evening, both of them having received the same alert through their respective agencies, and found her already methodically checking over her support gear, expression set into the same steady, determined focus he had come to rely on through every crisis they had faced together. This is it, she said quietly, not looking up from her equipment check. Whatever's coming, it's coming now. Then we face it the way we always have, Izuku said, crossing the small apartment to stand beside her, reaching for her hand and holding it tightly. Together. No matter what. Yayorozu turned to face him fully, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything further, simply holding on to each other in the quiet of their small shared home, gathering whatever strength and certainty they could from the other's presence before whatever waited for them beyond that evening finally arrived to test everything they had built, everything they still intended to claim on the far side of it, and everything they had promised, again and again, across 3 years of battles and one hard-won engagement that they would fight to protect. Chapter 21. The 48 hours between warning and strike compressed into a blur of emergency coordination that Izuku would later struggle to fully reconstruct in sequence, agencies across the city mobilizing into a defensive posture that had been rehearsed, in theory, for months, but had never actually been tested against a threat of this scale. UA itself became a coordination hub in those final hours, faculty and graduated alumni alike funneling through the campus to receive final assignments, and Izuku found himself, alongside Yayorozu, assigned to a rapid response unit tasked with protecting a densely populated residential district identified as a probable secondary target. They spent the night before the anticipated strike at the apartment, neither of them able to sleep despite knowing they would need every reserve of strength the coming day demanded, and eventually gave up the pretense entirely, sitting together at their small kitchen table with tea neither of them drank, talking quietly about everything and nothing, the kind of unhurried conversation that felt, in the shadow of what was coming, more precious than either of them could fully articulate. If something happens tomorrow, Yayorozu began carefully, and Izuku immediately reached across the table to still her hand. Nothing's happening to either of us tomorrow that we don't fight through together, he said, firm, refusing to let the thought fully take shape between them. I mean it, Momo. We survived everything this world has thrown at us so far because we face it as a unit. Tomorrow doesn't change that. She studied him for a long moment, something vulnerable and fierce both present in her expression at once, before nodding, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. you're right. I just wanted to say, regardless of what tomorrow holds, that these past 3 years have been the best of my life, and whatever else happens, I don't regret a single moment of choosing this path, or choosing you. Neither do I, Izuku said, voice thick with everything the moment held. Not for 1 second. They eventually retreated to bed in the small hours before dawn, though sleep remained elusive for both of them, and Izuku spent much of the remaining darkness simply holding Yayorozu close, memorizing the steady rhythm of her breathing, the familiar warmth of her presence, aware with painful clarity that whatever the coming day held, this quiet, ordinary moment of simply being together was its own kind of irreplaceable gift. Dawn arrived gray and overcast, fitting weather for the day the entire hero community had spent months dreading, and Izuku and Yayorozu suited up together in a silence that carried none of the fear either of them privately felt and all of the steady resolve they had built together across 3 years of shared battles. They received their final deployment briefing alongside their assigned unit, coordinates, and contingencies and emergency protocols delivered with the clipped efficiency of professionals who understood exactly how much rode on the coming hours, and when the briefing concluded, Izuku found one last moment to pull Yayorozu aside before their unit dispersed to its assigned position. Whatever happens today, he said, cupping her face in both hands, I need you to know that marrying you is still the plan. Not someday, not eventually, not if things work out. It's the plan, full stop, and I intend to make sure we both live to see it through. It's the plan, Yayorozu agreed, covering his hands with her own, her voice steady despite the visible emotion beneath it. I intend to hold you to it. They kissed once, brief and fierce and full of everything neither of them had words adequate to express, and then separated to take up their assigned positions, moving with the same disciplined focus that had carried them through every crisis before this one, each of them carrying, alongside their training and their equipment and their hard-won experience, the unshakable certainty of exactly what waited for them on the far side of whatever the coming battle demanded. In the distance, beyond the residential district's quiet morning streets, the first reports began crackling across emergency channels, unusual energy signatures detected at multiple points across the city, coordinated and deliberate, the unmistakable opening movement of the war the hero world had spent 2 long years bracing itself to survive. Izuku settled into position beside his unit, Yayorozu a steady presence at his side, and watched the horizon for the first sign of what was coming, ready as 3 years of training and love and hard-won partnership could make him, to meet it head-on. Chapter 22. The first warp gates opened just after 7 in the morning, blooming open across 6 separate districts in near-perfect synchronization, disgorging League forces in numbers the hero community's intelligence estimates had significantly undercounted. Izuku's unit held its assigned residential perimeter as the opening chaos rippled outward across the city, emergency broadcasts urging civilians toward designated shelters even as the first confirmed engagements crackled across every hero comm channel simultaneously, dozens of separate confrontations erupting within minutes of each other across a battlefield that had, overnight, expanded to encompass the entire metropolitan region. This is bigger than the briefing suggested, Yayorozu said grimly, already producing the first of what would likely be dozens of defensive barriers before the day was through, watching the district's northern approach where the earliest signs of League incursion had begun appearing. They didn't just prepare a strike force. They prepared an invasion. Izuku said nothing, conserving his breath and his focus for what he already understood was going to be the longest, hardest day of his career so far, full cowling already active, senses straining for the first sign of approaching threats. Somewhere across the city, he knew, every classmate he had trained beside for 3 years was taking up their own assigned position, every teacher who had shaped him into the hero he had become was preparing to hold their own line, and somewhere in the heart of whatever chaos the League had unleashed, Shigaraki himself was almost certainly moving toward whatever ultimate target his coalition's carefully coordinated assault had been built around. The first League operatives reached their district's perimeter within minutes, and Izuku and Yayorozu moved together to meet them with the same practiced, seamless coordination that had carried them through every battle since a chaotic exam day alley first brought them into each other's orbit, 2 people who had built, across 3 remarkable years, not just a partnership but a shared resolve strong enough to meet whatever the coming hours demanded. Whatever the true scope of the League's ambitions proved to be, whatever cost the day ultimately extracted from the hero community bracing to meet it, Izuku Midoriya intended to survive it, exactly as he had promised, standing beside the woman he loved, with a wedding still waiting for them on the other side of whatever trial the morning had only just begun to reveal. The battle for the city's survival, and for the fragile peace both of them had spent 3 years learning to fight for, had finally, irrevocably begun. Chapter 23. The engagement that followed tested every hour of training Izuku had accumulated since the day a sludge villain had nearly ended his life before it truly began. League operatives pressed the district's perimeter in coordinated waves rather than the disorganized skirmishing of earlier, smaller confrontations, each wave probing for weaknesses with a discipline that confirmed, more thoroughly than any intelligence briefing had, just how far Shigaraki's coalition had evolved under the shadow of All for One's returning influence. Izuku fought with a focus that narrowed the whole chaotic morning down to a series of immediate, solvable problems: an operative to intercept before she reached the evacuation route, a barrier to reinforce before it buckled under sustained pressure, a civilian to pull clear of a collapsing storefront before the structure gave way entirely. Yayarozau matched his pace throughout, her creations growing more sophisticated and more precisely tailored to each new threat as the morning wore on, months of dedicated training paying dividends in exactly the moments that mattered most. They lost the northern bloc an hour into the engagement, a tactical retreat rather than a rout, falling back to a secondary defensive line alongside 2 other rapid response units as League forces pressed the advantage with a coordinated numbers game that made clear just how significant a force Shigaraki's coalition had actually assembled. Izuku caught fragments of updates from other districts over the comm channel in the brief lulls between engagements: Endeavor's agency holding a critical junction downtown at heavy cost, a joint UA alumni unit repelling an assault on a hospital evacuation, scattered reports of casualties on both sides that made his chest tighten with each new transmission. "We can hold this line," Yayarozau said during one such lull, breathless, sweat and dust streaking her face, voice nonetheless carrying the same unshakable determination that had first drawn Izuku's attention across a chaotic exam ground 3 years earlier. "We have to hold this line." "We will," Izuku said, and meant it with everything he had left to give, drawing on reserves he had not known he still possessed as the next wave of League operatives came into view at the block's far end, the fight for the city, and for the future both of them had fought so hard to secure for themselves, far from finished, with the longest and hardest hours of the war still, unmistakably, waiting ahead of them. Chapter 24. By mid-afternoon, the secondary line had held through 3 more coordinated waves, each costlier than the last, and Izuku found himself operating on the kind of grim, exhausted momentum that came from a body running well past its normal limits, sustained by adrenaline and the singular refusal to let the line break while Yayarozau still stood beside him. Reinforcements arrived in the form of a veteran agency team redirected from a district that had, according to the TERSCOM update, successfully repelled its own assault, and for the first time since the morning's opening chaos, Izuku allowed himself a fraction of cautious relief. It did not last. A new transmission cut across the comm channel moments later, Aizawa's voice tight with an urgency Izuku had rarely heard from his old homeroom teacher, confirming what the shape of the day's coordinated assault had always threatened. Shigaraki himself had been sighted, moving with a small, heavily augmented escort toward the city's central command hub, the true target behind the League's sprawling diversionary assault finally revealed. "All available senior response units, converge on central command," Aizawa's voice crackled through every active comm channel simultaneously. "This is it. This is the target." Izuku felt Yayarozau's hand find his for one brief, steadying moment before both of them turned toward the new orders, the secondary line's remaining League forces already beginning to withdraw now that the assault's true purpose had been exposed, the day's fighting far from over but its final, decisive confrontation now unmistakably in motion. "This is what it's been building toward," Yayarozau said quietly, checking her remaining reserves with a focus that did not fully mask the apprehension beneath it. "Everything since Nizu's first briefing. It all leads here." "Then we go," Izuku said, already moving toward the rally point, full cowling burning at the edges of his exhausted but still willing body, Yayarozau falling into step beside him with the same unwavering resolve that had carried both of them through 3 years of battles building, without either of them fully realizing it until this exact moment, toward whatever waited for them now at the heart of the city, where Shigaraki Tomura, successor to All for One's terrible legacy, was making his final, decisive move. Whatever the confrontation ahead demanded of them, Izuku understood, walking toward it with Yayorozu's hand still laced through his own, it would decide far more than the fate of a single afternoon's battle. It would decide whether the future they had spent 3 years building together, the wedding still waiting on the other side of this war, the ordinary, extraordinary life they had promised each other in a dozen quiet moments across a dozen different battlefields, would survive to be claimed at all. They reached the rally point together, joined a hastily assembled strike force of UA's most capable alumni and veteran professionals alike, and moved out toward the city center as the afternoon sky darkened overhead, carrying with them everything they had built, everything they still intended to protect, and a resolve that neither exhaustion nor fear nor the terrible uncertainty of what waited ahead could shake loose. Chapter 25. The strike force moved through streets scarred by the day's fighting, past evacuated storefronts and cracked pavement, past the occasional exhausted hero unit still securing a cleared block, and Izuku found the closer they drew to the city center, the quieter and more focused his own mind became, adrenaline giving way to the same disciplined calm he had trained for years to summon in exactly this kind of moment. Yayorozu moved beside him with matching focus, her earlier apprehension folded away beneath the professional composure she had spent 3 years honing, both of them drawing steadiness from the other's presence the way they always had. "Whatever we find when we get there," Izuku said quietly, as the command hub's tall silhouette finally came into view above the surrounding rooftops, smoke curling from somewhere near its base, "we handle it the way we've handled everything else. Together, and one problem at a time." Together, Yayorozu agreed, the word carrying the full weight of everything it had come to mean between them across 3 remarkable years, a vow renewed once more on the edge of whatever trial waited just ahead. The strike force pressed forward into the gathering dusk, toward the heart of the city and the confrontation that had been building, quietly and then not so quietly, since the day Shigaraki Tomura's name first darkened UA's faculty briefings. Whatever the coming hours held, Izuku understood, walking into them with Yayorozu at his side and a wedding still waiting to be claimed on the other end of it, the war that would decide the shape of their future, and the future of everyone they had sworn to protect, had finally, fully arrived. Chapter 26. Night had nearly fallen by the time the strike force reached the outer cordon surrounding the command hub, veteran heroes and hastily organized alumni units alike converging from every direction the day's scattered battles had allowed, forming, block by block, the largest coordinated hero presence Izuku had ever personally witnessed. Somewhere beyond that cordon, intelligence confirmed, Shigaraki's escort had dug in around the hub's central tower, a final, decisive stand that promised to eclipse everything the city had already endured that day. Izuku scanned the assembling forces and found familiar faces scattered throughout, Todoroki arriving from the western district, Flame and Ice still smoking faintly from his own day's battles, Ida coordinating a civilian extraction team even now, at the very edge of the coming confrontation, Bakugo cutting through the gathering crowd with characteristic impatience, already scanning for the fastest path toward the fight. The found family that UA had built across 3 demanding years was assembling, unit by unit, for what all of them understood, without needing to say it aloud, would be the single most decisive battle any of them had yet faced. Yayorozu's hand tightened in his own as the final briefing began, command staff relaying what little further intelligence had been gathered about the tower's defenses, and Izuku listened with the same focused intensity he had carried since childhood, notebook long since replaced by battlefield instinct, ready as 3 years of training and love and hard-won partnership could make anyone, to walk into the heart of the war that would decide everything. Chapter 27. The order to advance came at last light, command staff signaling the assembled strike force forward in coordinated formation toward the tower's outer defenses, and Izuku felt the familiar, focused calm settle fully over him as he moved into position beside Yayorozu, the rest of their found family spreading out across the advancing line on every side. Whatever waited for them within that tower, whatever final confrontation with Shigaraki and the remnants of his coalition the coming hours held, Izuku understood that he was walking toward it exactly as he had promised, months and years of quiet vows finally converging into this single, decisive moment. He glanced once more at Yayorozu as the line began to move, found her already watching him with the same steady, unshakable resolve that had first drawn his attention across a chaotic exam ground 3 years earlier, and felt, despite everything the coming battle threatened, a certainty settle over him that no amount of danger could fully unseat. Whatever the tower held, they would face it together, and on the far side of it, Whatever the cost, he intended to keep every promise he had made. Starting with the wedding still waiting for them beyond the last, hardest fight of the war. The strike force crossed into the tower's outer perimeter as full darkness fell over the city, and the final battle for everything Izuku Midoriya and Yayarozau Momo had built together began. Chapter 21. The tower's outer defenses fell within the first 20 minutes, a coordinated breach that cost the strike force 2 hospitalized heroes and considerably more bruises than anyone had energy left to count, and Izuku found himself, once the outer perimeter was finally secure, standing in a stripped concrete atrium with Yayarozau at his side and the rest of the assembled strike force fanning out into smaller units to sweep the tower's lower floors for remaining resistance. Command wants us pushing toward the central stairwell, Todoroki reported, jogging over from a brief exchange with the unit coordinator, ice still crackling faintly along one forearm from the last engagement. Shigaraki's escort dug in around the 7th floor. They want our unit on point, since we've got the most combat experience against Enhanced League operatives. Izuku nodded, exhaustion warring with the same disciplined focus that had carried him through every crisis since childhood, and fell into step behind Todoroki as their unit began the methodical climb, clearing each floor before advancing to the next, the tower's fluorescent emergency lighting casting everything in a harsh, flickering wash that made every shadow feel like a potential threat. They met resistance on the 4th floor. 3 enhanced operatives whose quirks bore the unmistakable signature of the same research program that had produced the earlier infiltrators. Strength and speed pushed well past natural limits by whatever process All for One's reactivated network had developed. Izuku met the largest of them head-on, full cowling driving a strike that would have shattered an ordinary opponent's guard and instead simply staggered this one, confirming within seconds that the enhancement was significant enough to demand real caution rather than raw aggression. Yayarozau adapted almost instantly, producing a dense restraint webbing designed to slow rather than stop the operative's movement, buying Izuku the fractional advantage he needed to finish the exchange with a follow-up strike that finally dropped his opponent for good. Todoroki handled the second operative with a controlled burst of ice that encased the enhanced villain from the knees down, and the third, cornered and outnumbered, surrendered rather than press an unwinnable fight. 4th floor clear, Izuku reported into his calm, breathing hard, already scanning the stairwell for the next threat. Moving to 5th. The climb continued in that same grinding rhythm, floor after floor of coordinated resistance met with equally coordinated response, and by the time their unit finally reached the 6th floor landing, Izuku's body had settled into the particular exhausted clarity that came from operating well past the point where fatigue should have slowed him, adrenaline and purpose carrying him forward when raw strength alone would have faltered. 1 floor to the escort, Yayarozau said quietly, checking her remaining reserves with the same careful assessment she brought to every critical decision. Whatever's waiting up there, it's going to be the hardest fight yet. I can feel it. I know, Izuku said, meeting her eyes in the flickering emergency light, drawing strength from the steady resolve he found there. Whatever it is, we handle it the way we've handled everything else. Together, she said, the word carrying the full weight of 3 years and 100 battles behind it, and together they climbed the final flight toward the 7th floor, where Shigaraki Tomura's last line of defense waited to test everything the strike force had left to give. Chapter 22. The 7th floor opened into a gutted office space, support columns exposed where decay had eaten through drywall and paneling in jagged, deliberate patterns, and at its center stood a figure Izuku recognized immediately from 100 briefing photographs and one unforgettable downtown skirmish, Shigaraki himself, flanked by 2 heavily augmented lieutenants, waiting with the same eerie stillness that had haunted Izuku's threat assessments for years. Took you long enough, Shigaraki said, voice carrying a flat, contemptuous amusement that did nothing to hide the coiled danger beneath it. I was starting to think Yue's golden children had lost their nerve. Stand down, Todoroki called, ice already forming along both forearms, the rest of their unit fanning into defensive positions around the office's perimeter. This ends here, one way or another. It does, Shigaraki agreed, and something in the casual certainty of his tone sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through Izuku's already exhausted body. Just not the way you're expecting. The 2 lieutenants moved first, breaking toward Todoroki and a second strike force member with coordinated speed that confirmed, immediately, the same enhancement signature the earlier floors had already demonstrated. Izuku surged forward to intercept the nearer of the 2, full cowling burning at full output despite the toll 6 floors of continuous fighting had already extracted, and traded a brutal exchange of blows that left both combatants staggered before Yayorozu's timely intervention. A reinforced restraint deployed with split-second precision, finally tipped the confrontation decisively in their favor. Shigaraki watched the unfolding chaos with detached, almost clinical interest, making no move to join his lieutenant's losing fight, and Izuku understood, with the particular clarity that came from years spent studying exactly this kind of opponent, that the real confrontation had not yet begun. "You're waiting for something," Izuku said, breathing hard, positioning himself between Shigaraki and the rest of his straining unit. "This whole floor. It's a delay." Something that might have been approval flickered across Shigaraki's scarred features. "Smart. Always were smart, weren't you, Midoriya? All Might's favorite. His replacement, isn't that the story everyone tells?" His fingers twitched, 5 points of terrible potential energy that every hero in the room had been trained since childhood to fear. "Doesn't matter how smart you are, though. The distractions already worked. My real target isn't this floor. It never was." The words landed like a physical blow, and Izuku's stomach dropped as he processed the implication, comm channel crackling to life a half-second later with an update that confirmed his worst fear. A second, smaller League cell had used the tower assault's chaos as cover to breach the city's actual command infrastructure several blocks away, a target the strike force's full attention had been deliberately, ruthlessly drawn away from. "You used us," Izuku said, fury and horror warring in his chest as the full scope of the deception settled over him. "This whole floor, this whole fight, it was never about the tower. Everything's a distraction until it isn't," Shigaraki said, and lunged. Izuku met the attack with everything he had left, full cowling screaming past its normal limits as decay-scarred fingers grazed close enough to his forearm that he felt the terrible, crawling threat of the quirk even through a defense that barely, narrowly held. Yayorozu was at his side an instant later, restraints and barriers deploying with desperate speed as the true shape of the day's battle finally, fully revealed itself. The tower had never been the target at all, and somewhere across the city, the real confrontation was only just beginning. Chapter 23. The fight against Shigaraki himself unfolded with a speed and lethality that made every prior confrontation of Izuku's career feel, in retrospect, like careful rehearsal for this single, decisive moment. Decay licked at the edges of every barrier Yayorozu produced, forcing her to abandon each defensive structure the instant it had served its purpose rather than risk the crawling destruction spreading further than intended. And Izuku found himself fighting not just to land a blow but to simply survive within range of an opponent whose quirk turned every near miss into a genuine, existential threat. "We can't win this through attrition," Yayorozu called, already reworking her approach, producing a series of rapid, disposable barriers designed less to block Shigaraki's advance than to control the geometry of the fight itself, forcing him into positions that limited his effective range. "Izuku, I need 3 seconds of clean opening, that's all. I have an idea." "You'll have it," Izuku said, and drove forward with everything his exhausted body still had left to give, full cowling burning at an output he knew he could not sustain much longer, buying the precise window Yayorozu needed through sheer, desperate force of will. She used it decisively, producing a containment structure unlike anything Izuku had seen her create before, dense layered material engineered specifically, in the split seconds of frantic calculation the fight had allowed her, to interrupt the specific mechanical requirements of Shigaraki's quirk, a solution born from months of exactly the kind of theoretical countermeasure planning she had once described running through her head in idle moments, now deployed in the single moment that mattered most. It worked. For a handful of critical seconds, Shigaraki's decay finding no purchase against material Yayorozu had engineered specifically to resist it, and in that narrow window Izuku closed the remaining distance and landed a strike with the full, concentrated force of everything One for All could still muster from his exhausted body, a blow that sent Shigaraki crashing backward through a support column with enough force to finally, genuinely stagger him. It was not enough to end the fight. Shigaraki rose from the wreckage with blood at his temple and fury replacing his earlier detached amusement, and the confrontation that followed tested every remaining reserve both Izuku and Yayorozu possessed, each exchange growing more desperate, more costly, as the true scale of what stood between the strike force and any hope of ending the war that day became fully, brutally apparent. It was Todoroki's timely intervention, ice and fire combined into a searing, disorienting barrage that finally forced Shigaraki onto the defensive for the first time in the entire engagement, that gave Izuku the opening he needed for one final, decisive strike, one for all channeled through every remaining fragment of strength his body could summon, a blow that finally, definitively ended the confrontation, Shigaraki collapsing amid the office's ruined wreckage as the last of his enhanced lieutenants finally fell to the rest of the straining strike force. The floor went suddenly, eerily quiet in the aftermath, and Izuku sank to one knee amid the wreckage, full cowling finally, fully spent, aware distantly of Yayorozu's hand checking him over with frantic urgency, aware more sharply still of the comm channel still crackling with updates from the true battle unfolding across the city, the confrontation they had all just survived, only the opening act of a war whose real, decisive climax was still, even now, being fought several blocks away. "He's down," Izuku managed, voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Shigaraki's down. But Command Hub, they still need." "I know," Yayorozu said, already pulling him upright, her own exhaustion evident in every strained line of her posture but her resolve, as always, unshaken. "We're not done yet. Can you keep moving?" "For you," Izuku said, finding one last reserve of strength in the steady certainty of her presence, always. Chapter 24. The journey across the city toward the command hub unfolded through streets transformed by a full day of continuous warfare, wreckage and scattered emergency response units marking the path of a battle that had, by nightfall, tested every resource the hero community possessed. Izuku and Yayorozu moved with the remnants of their strike force, exhaustion held at bay by pure necessity, comm channels crackling with increasingly urgent updates from the command hub confrontation that confirmed the true stakes of the day's fighting had, all along, been concentrated in that single, decisive location. They arrived to find the command hub's perimeter already engaged in brutal, close-quarters fighting, a coalition of veteran pros and UA alumni holding a defensive line against a League force considerably smaller than the diversionary army that had assaulted the tower but equipped, it quickly became clear, with resources and augmentation more dangerous than anything the earlier engagement had demonstrated. All for one's lingering influence, Izuku understood, watching the desperate fighting unfold, had been concentrated here all along, the tower's elaborate diversion nothing more than a costly, deliberate feint. "We need every available fighter on that perimeter," the coordinating officer barked as their exhausted unit arrived, and Izuku fell into position without hesitation despite a body screaming for rest he could not yet afford to take, Yayorozu matching his pace with the same grim, unwavering determination. The fighting that followed blurred into a series of increasingly desperate engagements, League operatives pressing the hub's defenses with a coordination that suggested a final, all-or-nothing commitment to the day's objective, and Izuku found himself, more than once, drawing on reserves he had not known remained, sustained by nothing more than sheer refusal to let the line break while Yayorozu still stood beside him. She matched that refusal blow for blow, her creations growing steadily more improvised and more desperate as her own reserves dwindled, and still she did not falter, still she produced exactly what each critical moment demanded. It was deep into that grinding confrontation, the command hub's defenses stretched to their absolute limit, that the day's true crisis finally arrived, a secondary League cell, augmented operatives held in reserve for exactly this purpose, breached the hub's inner perimeter through a maintenance access point the day's chaos had left insufficiently guarded, threatening to reach the hub's core infrastructure and, with it, deal the hero community's command capacity a blow from which recovery might prove impossible. Izuku and Yayorozu were among the nearest responders when the breach alarm sounded, and they moved together without hesitation, cutting through the hub's lower corridors toward the threatened access point with a speed that pushed both of their exhausted bodies past every reasonable limit, driven by the shared, unspoken understanding that whatever remained of the day's fighting, this single crisis point would likely decide the war's ultimate outcome. They reached the breach in time, barely, and the confrontation that followed, brutal and desperate in the hub's narrow, unforgiving corridors, tested everything both of them had left to give in a fight that would determine, in the space of a few frantic, decisive minutes, whether the sacrifice of an entire day's fighting would ultimately prove to have been enough. Chapter 25. The corridor fight was, in its own way, more terrifying than the confrontation with Shigaraki himself had been, close quarters allowing no room for the careful, coordinated tactics that had carried Izuku and Yayorozu through every previous engagement, forcing instead a brutal, immediate reliance on raw instinct and whatever fragments of strength their exhausted bodies still possessed. Izuku met the lead operative head-on, absorbing a blow that would have shattered bone in an unenhanced body and driving back with everything One for All's remaining reserves could offer, while Yayarozau, pinned against the corridor's narrow confines, produced a series of rapid, improvised defensive structures that bought precious seconds against operatives whose enhanced speed made every exchange a desperate gamble. "There's too many," she called, breathless, blood trickling from a shallow cut along her temple where a near miss had grazed too close. "Izuku, I don't have enough reserves left to hold this corridor much longer." "Then we don't hold it," Izuku said, thinking fast despite the exhaustion fogging his mind, "we collapse it." "Can you seal the passage behind them if I push them forward?" Yayarozu's eyes widened with immediate understanding, and she nodded once, already gathering what remained of her strength for the effort the plan demanded. Izuku surged forward with everything he had left, driving the lead operatives deeper into the confined corridor with a series of desperate, all-or-nothing strikes, buying Yayarozau the precise window she needed to produce a final, massive structural seal, reinforced steel and dense composite material collapsing across the corridor's width with a resounding crash that trapped the remaining League operatives on the far side, cut off from the hub's core infrastructure they had been so close to reaching. The improvised solution cost Yayarozau the last of her reserves, and she staggered, consciousness visibly fraying at the edges from the sheer volume of mass conversion the desperate effort had demanded. Izuku caught her before she fully collapsed, both of them sinking to the corridor floor amid the wreckage of the fight, breathing hard, the trapped operatives on the far side of the seal already being handled by reinforcements arriving in response to the crisis alert. "You did it," Izuku said, holding her upright, relief and exhaustion warring for dominance in his own battered body. "Momo, you actually did it, the breach is sealed." "We did it," she corrected weakly, managing a faint, exhausted smile despite everything the day had extracted from both of them. Together. Like always. They remained there together on the corridor floor for a long moment, gathering whatever strength they could from simply having survived, from the crisis finally, genuinely resolved, before the arriving reinforcement team reached them and began the careful process of ensuring both were stable enough to be moved to the hub's improvised medical station, the war's most decisive day finally, mercifully drawing toward its close. Word filtered through the recovering strike force in fragments over the following hour. Shigaraki himself confirmed captured rather than killed, the tower's remaining resistance fully neutralized, the command hub's core infrastructure secured despite the desperate final breach attempt, League forces across every engaged district finally, comprehensively broken and in full retreat. The war that had loomed over Izuku and Yayarozau's entire adult life, the confrontation Nizu had warned them about years earlier, had, against every uncertain odds the day's fighting had presented, finally, decisively ended in the hero community's favor. Izuku, propped against a makeshift medical cot with Yayarozau resting beside him, both of them wrapped in the particular hollow exhaustion that came after surviving something neither had been fully certain they would survive, allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to simply breathe, and to feel, beneath the exhaustion and the lingering adrenaline, the quiet, overwhelming relief of a future finally, genuinely secured. Chapter 26. The days immediately following the battle's end unfolded in a strange, suspended haze of recovery and reckoning, the full scope of the war's cost becoming clear only gradually as casualty reports consolidated and the hero community began the long, difficult process of assessing exactly what the day had taken from it. Izuku spent much of that first week in and out of medical evaluation, his body bearing the accumulated toll of a battle that had pushed him well past every limit he had previously tested, while Yayarozau, similarly depleted, underwent her own careful recovery under close medical supervision. They spent much of that recovery period together, propped in adjacent beds at the same recovery facility, drawing comfort from simple proximity even when neither had the energy for extended conversation, and Izuku found, in those quiet, exhausted hours, that the relief of having survived carried its own particular weight, an emotional reckoning that took longer to process than the physical injuries themselves. News arrived on the third day of recovery that Shigaraki, secured now in a maximum containment facility built specifically to hold quirks of his caliber, had survived the battle's end in a diminished, heavily restrained state, all for one's lingering influence over his coalition finally, comprehensively severed by his capture. The League itself, deprived of its central command structure and battered by losses across every engaged district, had fractured into scattered, disorganized remnants that intelligence assessments suggested would take years, if ever, to reconstitute into anything resembling the coordinated threat the hero community had just weathered. "It's actually over," Yayarozau said quietly on the fourth day, both of them finally strong enough to sit up properly, sharing a quiet meal in the recovery facility's common room. "I keep waiting to feel it fully, and I don't think I have yet. It still feels like something we should be bracing against." "I know what you mean," Izuku admitted, reaching for her hand across the small table between them. "I think it's going to take a while before either of us stops flinching at every alert notification. But it is over, Momo. We made it through. We actually made it through." She studied him for a long moment, something fragile and hopeful breaking through the lingering exhaustion in her expression, and Izuku watched her allow herself, visibly and deliberately, to believe it fully for what seemed like the first time since the war's opening had shattered their carefully planned future into uncertainty months earlier. "We have a wedding to plan," she said finally, voice catching slightly on the words, as though saying them aloud made the promise more real than it had felt and longer than either of them wanted to admit. "An actual wedding, without a war hanging over the date this time." "We do," Izuku said, and felt something in his own chest finally, fully unclench for the first time since Nizu's initial briefing had first confirmed the shape of the war both of them had spent years bracing to survive. "Whenever you're ready. However you want it. I meant what I told you before all of this started. Everything else is just decoration. I just need you." Yayarozu's answering smile, unguarded and radiant despite the visible exhaustion still shadowing her features, carried the full weight of everything they had survived together to reach this exact, quiet, ordinary moment. Two people, battered but whole, finally free to claim the future they had spent 3 years, and one long, decisive war, fighting to protect. Chapter 27. Full discharge from the recovery facility came a week later, both of them cleared for light duty with strict instructions to avoid full field deployment for at least another month, and Izuku found the transition back to their small shared apartment carrying an entirely different quality than any homecoming before it, the accumulated weight of years spent bracing for exactly the war they had just survived finally, fully lifted from every ordinary moment. Their first evening home passed in a comfortable, unhurried quiet, both of them too depleted for anything more ambitious than simply existing together in the space they had built, and it was there, curled together on their small couch with the city lights glittering ordinary and unthreatening beyond their window, that the conversation about the wedding finally, properly began. "My mother is going to want an elaborate ceremony," Yayarozu said, half amused and half resigned, already anticipating the conversation that awaited her once she informed her family the long-delayed wedding could finally proceed. "She's had a contingency plan assembled for over a year now, venue and caterers and guest list all ready to activate the moment we gave the word. Do you want elaborate?" Izuku asked, genuinely curious, tracing idle patterns along her arm where she rested against his shoulder. Yayarozu considered the question seriously, the same careful thoroughness she brought to every important decision. "I want our people there," she said finally. "Everyone from Class 1A, your mother, my parents, the faculty who shaped us into who we are. Beyond that, I don't think I need elaborate. I think I just need it to feel like us." "Then that's what we'll build," Izuku said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Whatever size makes sense, as long as it feels like us." The planning that followed unfolded across the subsequent weeks with a lighter, more joyful energy than either of them had experienced during the earlier, war-shadowed engagement, every decision made now without the constant undercurrent of uncertainty that had once colored even their happiest moments together. Yayarozu's mother, true to prediction, produced her carefully maintained contingency plans with barely concealed delight, and the two of them spent an entire afternoon touring venues her family had already vetted, eventually settling on a modest garden estate that offered exactly the intimate, personal atmosphere Yayarozu had described wanting. Izuku's own contributions to the planning leaned toward the smaller, more personal details, handwriting the invitations himself rather than commissioning formal printing, insisting on selecting the ceremony's music personally rather than delegating the choice, spending an entire evening with his mother poring over old photographs to select the images that would decorate the reception space, each one a small, deliberate act of investment in a day he had once feared, during the war's darkest hours, that he might never actually get to see arrive. Class 1A's reaction to the news, once it spread through the group chat that had somehow survived 3 years of chaos and a full-scale war without ever losing its irreverent energy, arrived within minutes in a flood of enthusiastic messages, Uraraka immediately volunteering to help with every possible detail, Mina already drafting elaborate decoration proposals nobody had asked for, Ida delivering, predictably, a lengthy and entirely sincere message about the significance of the milestone. That had the whole chat laughing within seconds of its arrival. "They're going to turn the whole thing into chaos," Yayarozau observed, scrolling through the flood of messages with fond exasperation, "aren't they?" "Probably," Izuku agreed, laughing. "I wouldn't want it any other way." Chapter 28. The weeks of planning passed in a warm, steady rhythm that neither of them had fully allowed themselves to imagine during the long years of war preparation that had shadowed their earlier engagement, every decision made now with the settled certainty of people building toward a future they finally, genuinely believed they would get to claim. Izuku returned to light agency duty as his body finished healing, the work carrying a different quality now, urgent but no longer shadowed by the constant dread of an approaching, undefined catastrophe, and Yayarozau resumed her own responsibilities with the same renewed lightness, her creation quirks applications and ongoing recovery efforts across the city proving as valuable in peacetime reconstruction as it had been throughout the war itself. They visited his mother together on a quiet Sunday, Inko greeting the news of the finally approaching wedding date with the same overwhelmed delight she had shown at every milestone since Izuku first mentioned Yayarozau's name years earlier, immediately producing an old family photo album and insisting on sharing embarrassing childhood stories that left Izuku groaning while Yayarozau laughed, delighted, committing every detail to memory with obvious affection. "I always hoped," Inko told her, holding both of Yayarozau's hands in her own, eyes bright with unshed tears, "that Izuku would find someone who saw him the way I always have. Someone who understood that his heart is the strongest thing about him, stronger even than whatever quirk he carries. I knew, the very first time he mentioned you, that he'd found exactly that." Yayarozau's own composure, so carefully maintained through years of high-pressure crises, wavered visibly at the sentiment, and she embraced Izuku's mother with genuine, unguarded warmth that left Izuku watching the two women he loved most in the world with a fullness in his chest he had no adequate words for. Yayarozau's own family, in turn, embraced the approaching wedding with characteristic thoroughness, her father quietly commissioning a set of formal wear for Izuku that fit with a precision that made clear considerable effort had gone into the gesture, her mother finalizing venue details with the same exacting standards she brought to every important undertaking, both of them treating Izuku, in every visible way, as fully and permanently part of the family he was marrying into. The final weeks before the ceremony compressed into a flurry of last details, final fittings, a rehearsal that dissolved twice into helpless laughter when Minetta's attempt at officiant duties for the rehearsal run-through went predictably, chaotically wrong before Ida stepped in with characteristic seriousness to restore order. A bachelor gathering organized by Bakugo of all people that consisted mostly of the old Class 1A crowd reminiscing about 3 years of shared chaos over a quiet dinner that left Izuku unexpectedly emotional by the evening's end. "You've come a long way," Bakugo told him gruffly near the evening's close, uncharacteristically sincere. "From the quirkless kid who used to follow me around. I'm glad you found someone who sees what the rest of us eventually figured out. Don't screw it up, Deku." "I don't intend to," Izuku said, laughing despite the emotion thick in his throat, and found himself, walking home that night through familiar streets finally, fully at peace, more grateful than he had words for every person and every trial that had brought him to the threshold of the life he was about to begin. Chapter 29. The morning of the wedding arrived clear and bright, none of the gray overcast that had hung over the war's decisive final battle anywhere in evidence, and Izuku woke in the small guest room at his mother's apartment, where tradition and his mother's insistence had dictated he spend the final night before the ceremony apart from his bride, with a nervous, giddy energy he had not felt since the morning of the UA entrance exam years earlier. Inko fussed over him throughout the morning with barely contained emotion, adjusting his collar twice more than necessary, dabbing at her eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, and finally, once he was fully dressed in the formal wear Yayarozau's father had commissioned, took both his hands in her own and looked at him with the same fierce, unwavering pride she had carried through every milestone of his unlikely journey. Your father should be here to see this, she said quietly, an old grief threading briefly through her voice before she set it aside with visible resolve. But I don't think either of us needs him to be, not really. You built this life yourself, Izuku, out of nothing but stubbornness and heart, and today you're claiming the best part of everything you built. I am so unbelievably proud of you. Izuku embraced his mother tightly, gratitude and love and a lifetime of shared struggle compressed into the simple, wordless gesture, and when they finally separated, both of them were laughing through tears at the absurdity of nearly ruining his careful appearance minutes before the ceremony was due to begin. The garden venue, when they arrived, had been transformed by weeks of careful planning into exactly the intimate, personal space both Izuku and Yayarozau had wanted. String lights woven through the surrounding trees, simple white chairs arranged in neat rows facing an arbor draped in seasonal flowers, the whole space filled already with the familiar, beloved faces of everyone who had shaped the journey that led them here. Izuku spotted Uraraka and Ida seated together near the front, Todoroki beside them looking uncharacteristically emotional, Bakugo standing near the back with arms crossed and an expression that fooled absolutely no one about the sentiment he was trying to hide. Faculty members scattered throughout the gathered crowd, All Might himself, retired now but still radiating the same warm presence Izuku remembered from his earliest days at UA, seated with obvious pride near the front. Izuku took his position at the arbor with Ida standing beside him as best man, hands trembling slightly with a nervous anticipation entirely different from anything a villain had ever managed to provoke in him, and waited, breath caught somewhere in his chest, for the ceremony's music to signal the moment he had been waiting for since a chaotic exam day Ali first introduced him to the woman he was about to marry. The music began, and the gathered guests rose, and Izuku's entire world narrowed to the sight of Yayarozau appearing at the garden's entrance on her father's arm, radiant in a simple, elegant gown that suited her far better than anything elaborate could have, her dark hair caught up with a few loose strands framing her face exactly the way it had the first time he had truly noticed her, years and a lifetime of shared battles ago. She met his gaze across the length of the aisle and something in her composed, careful expression broke open into unguarded, overwhelming joy, and Izuku felt his own eyes sting with emotion he made no effort to hide as she began the walk toward him. Chapter 30. Her father delivered her into Izuku's care at the arbor with a firm, warm handshake and a whispered word Izuku would carry with him for the rest of his life, and then it was simply the two of them standing together before the officiant, before everyone who mattered most in either of their lives, the accumulated weight of 3 years and a war and every quiet promise exchanged along the way finally, fully converging into this single, sacred moment. The officiant, a family friend Yayarozau's mother had specifically requested for the honor, spoke briefly of commitment and partnership before turning the ceremony over to the vows both of them had written individually, kept carefully secret from each other in the weeks leading up to the day, and Izuku, hands trembling slightly around the small card he had prepared, found himself abandoning the careful words he had rehearsed in favor of something more immediate and true. I used to fill notebooks with observations about other people's strength, he began, voice unsteady but growing surer as he continued, because I didn't believe I'd ever have any strength of my own worth writing down. You were the first person who made me believe that wasn't true, not because of anything you said, but because of how you treated me, from the very first moment we met, as someone worth helping, worth trusting, worth building something with. Every battle we fought together, every quiet evening, every hard year of a war I wasn't always certain we'd survive, you were the reason I kept believing it was worth fighting for. I promise you, standing here today, that I will spend the rest of my life being exactly that reason for you in return. Yayarozau's composure, already fragile with emotion, broke fully at the words, tears spilling freely as she reached for his hands, and when it came her turn to speak, her own carefully prepared vows gave way to the same raw, unguarded honesty. I told my mother once that I was exceptionally selective about matters of the heart, she said, voice thick but steady, and I meant it, though I don't think even I understood, at the time, how selective I truly was. I was waiting, without knowing it, for someone who would see the parts of me that work hardest and love them instead of simply using them. You saw that in an alley on the worst 10 minutes of my life, and you have kept seeing it, kept choosing it, every single day since, through every trial this world has thrown at us. I promise you my whole heart, Izuku, not because I'm obligated to, but because after 3 years of watching you fight for everyone around you with everything you have, I cannot imagine wanting to give my heart to anyone else. The exchange of rings passed in a blur of overwhelming emotion, and when the officiant finally, formally pronounced them married, the garden erupted into joyful applause and more than a few audible sobs from the assembled crowd, Uraraka's happy crying audible even over the general celebration, and Izuku, framing his new wife's face in both hands, kissed her with everything 3 years of careful, patient devotion had built between them, sealing a promise that had first taken quiet root in a chaotic exam day alley and had, against every uncertain odds a war-torn world had presented, finally, fully bloomed into the life both of them had spent years fighting to claim. Chapter 31. The reception unfolded in the same garden as the ceremony, tables arranged beneath the string lights that had grown steadily more magical as afternoon slipped into evening, and Izuku found the celebration that followed carrying the particular, irreplaceable warmth of a found family finally, fully allowed to celebrate together without the shadow of an approaching war hanging over the gathering. Ida's best man speech ran considerably longer than tradition typically allowed, delivered with such characteristic, earnest formality that it had the entire reception laughing within the first minute, working through a meticulously organized account of Izuku and Yayorozu's relationship complete with what he insisted on calling key developmental milestones, before finally, unexpectedly, breaking into genuine emotion as he described watching 2 of his closest friends build something worth celebrating amid years of genuine danger. I have never known 2 people better suited to weather any storm together, Ida concluded, raising his glass with visible emotion. To Izuku and Momo. May every storm ahead of you be considerably smaller than the ones you've already survived. Uraraka's speech as maid of honor followed, warmer and less structured than Ida's, full of affectionate stories about Yayorozu's quiet, steady kindness across 3 years of shared dormitory life, and closed with a toast that left barely a dry eye among the assembled guests. Even Bakugo, cornered by popular demand into offering a few words, managed a gruff, uncharacteristically sincere toast that acknowledged, in his own blunt fashion, how far both of them had come since their earliest days at UA. The dancing that followed carried the celebration late into the evening, Izuku and Yayorozu sharing their first dance as a married couple beneath the string lights while their assembled friends and family watched with visible joy, and Izuku found himself, holding his wife close as the music carried them in slow, unhurried circles, more fully at peace than he had ever imagined possible during the long, uncertain years the war had demanded of them both. Regrets? Yayorozu asked softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they danced, the question carrying a teasing lightness that had nothing genuinely uncertain behind it. Not one, Izuku said, pressing a kiss to her hair. Every hard year, every battle, every moment I was terrified we wouldn't make it here. I wouldn't trade a single one of them, because they all led to this. They danced late into the night, surrounded by everyone who had shaped the unlikely, hard-won journey that had brought them to this garden, this evening, this marriage neither of them had ever fully allowed themselves to take for granted, and when the celebration finally began winding down, Izuku and Yayorozu slipped away together, hand in hand, toward the beginning of a life they had spent 3 years and 1 decisive war fighting to claim. Chapter 32. The months that followed the wedding settled into a rhythm neither of them had fully dared imagine during the war's darkest uncertainty, ordinary life reclaiming its rightful place at the center of their days even as both continued their hero work, now conducted in a world finally, genuinely at peace rather than braced against an ever-present threat. Izuku's reputation continued growing across that first peacetime year, his name increasingly mentioned alongside the generation of heroes who had carried the profession through its hardest test, though he remained, in every way that mattered most to him, the same earnest, dedicated person who had once filled notebooks with quiet, hopeful observation. Yayorozu's own career flourished in the reconstructed piece, her creation quirk finding new, celebrated applications in the ongoing work of rebuilding communities the war had damaged, and she approached that work with the same thorough, compassionate dedication she had always brought to every challenge, earning a reputation entirely her own rather than one defined only by her marriage. They settled fully into the small apartment that had once felt, during the war's uncertain months, like borrowed time between crises, and found it transformed now into something steadier and more permanent, a home, filled gradually with the small, accumulated evidence of a shared life, photographs from the wedding displayed proudly on a shelf beside older photographs from their UA years, a life built deliberately and gratefully from the ashes of everything they had survived to reach it. Class 1A's bond, forged across 3 demanding years and tempered by a war that had tested every one of them beyond anything they could have imagined as first-year students, remained as strong in peacetime as it had been through every crisis, regular gatherings keeping the found family Izuku had built at UA an active, cherished part of both his and Yayorozu's ongoing lives. Uraraka and Yayorozu remained close as ever, regular visits and shared confidences carrying the easy warmth of friendship that had first blossomed during their earliest, uncertain days as classmates. Bakugo's gruff friendship with Izuku, transformed over years from rivalry into something genuinely fond, continued in its own particular fashion, regular sparring sessions that Yayorozu had learned to view with fond, exasperated tolerance. On a quiet evening nearly a year after the wedding, Izuku found Yayorozu on their small apartment balcony, watching the city lights with the same thoughtful stillness he had first noticed in her all those years ago at the UA entrance exam gate, and settled beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as she leaned into him, the two of them simply existing together in the comfortable, ordinary silence that had become one of the quiet joys of their shared life. "Do you ever think about that, Allie?" she asked eventually, a faint smile playing at her lips. "The exam. If you hadn't stepped in when you did, if we hadn't ended up in the same class, the same year, everything that followed." "All the time," Izuku admitted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I think about how easily it could have gone differently, and I'm endlessly grateful it didn't." "So am I," Yayorozu said softly, turning to meet his eyes with the same warm, steady certainty that had carried both of them through every trial since that chaotic exam day encounter first set them on this unlikely, extraordinary path together. "Whatever comes next, Izuku, I'm glad it's with you." "Always," Izuku said, and meant it with everything he had, holding his wife close beneath a peaceful evening sky, grateful beyond measure for every hard year and every quiet victory that had led them, at last, to this hard-won, ordinary, extraordinary life they had built together, and finally intended to keep. Chapter 33. Nearly 2 years after the war's end, Izuku found himself standing once more at the entrance of a familiar training ground, this time not as a nervous applicant but as a guest speaker invited to address UA's newest generation of hopeful hero course applicants, a full circle he had never fully expected to walk. He looked out over the assembled crowd of anxious teenagers, all of them carrying the same mixture of hope and uncertainty he remembered from his own entrance exam years earlier, and found himself, for a moment, transported back to the boy who had once believed his dream was permanently out of reach. "I was told, for most of my childhood, that I couldn't be a hero," he told the gathered applicants, voice carrying clearly across the training ground. "Not because I lacked the courage or the will, but because of circumstances I couldn't control. I want you to understand, standing here today, that the path to becoming who you're meant to be rarely looks the way you expect it to. Mine certainly didn't. It was harder, and stranger, and more painful than I ever imagined, but it also gave me things I never could have planned for. Friends who became family. A partner who became my whole world. A community worth every sacrifice it demanded. Whatever happens today, whatever the exam decides, I want you to remember that the outcome isn't the end of your story. It's only the beginning of it." He caught sight of Yayorozu near the back of the observation area, having accompanied him for the occasion, her proud smile visible even from this distance, and felt the same steady warmth that had anchored him through every trial since the day they first met settle over him now, familiar and unshakable. The exam proceeded much as his own once had, nervous applicants funneling into the mock city for their practical trials, and Izuku found himself watching with a mixture of nostalgia and quiet hope, remembering vividly the chaos and uncertainty of his own exam day, the chance encounter in a rope-tangled alley that had, in ways he could never have predicted, shaped the entire course of his adult life. "Do you think any of them will find what we found?" Yayorozu asked afterward, joining him as the exam wound down, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity of years spent exactly this close together. "I hope so," Izuku said, watching the exhausted, hopeful applicants filing back out through the gates, each one carrying their own uncertain future ahead of them. "I hope every one of them finds something worth fighting for, the way we did." They walked together back toward the parking area as the afternoon light softened toward evening, past the familiar grounds that had shaped so much of both their lives, and Izuku found himself, as he so often did now in quiet, unremarkable moments like this one, simply grateful, fully and completely, for the unlikely, hard-won path that had led him here, to this life, to this partnership, to a peace that no longer felt fragile or borrowed but permanent, earned, and entirely, wonderfully his own. Chapter 34. That evening, back in the quiet of their apartment, Yayarozau prepared a simple dinner while Izuku reviewed the day's agency reports at their small kitchen table, the domestic ordinariness of the scene carrying a warmth that still, even after 2 years of marriage, occasionally struck him with quiet, disbelieving gratitude. He set the reports aside as she joined him at the table, and found her watching him with a particular, thoughtful expression he had learned, over years together, to recognize as the precursor to something important. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, reaching for his hand across the table, "about what you said today, to the applicants. About the path to becoming who you're meant to be looking different than expected. What about it?" Izuku asked, curious, though something in her tone had already sent a flicker of anticipation through his chest. "I think our own path might be about to look different again," she said, and the smile that followed, soft and radiant and full of a joy she was clearly struggling to contain, told him everything he needed to know before she finished the sentence. "Izuku, I'm pregnant." The reports on the table were entirely forgotten in the moment that followed, Izuku rising immediately to pull her into an embrace fierce enough to lift her slightly off her feet, laughter and tears mingling freely as the news settled fully into both of them, another unexpected, unplanned chapter opening in a story neither of them could have written for themselves years earlier in a chaotic exam day alley. "We're going to be parents," Izuku said, wonder and joy threading through every word, still holding her close. "Momo, we're actually going to be parents." "We are," she confirmed, laughing through happy tears, resting her forehead against his. "I know it's not something we'd fully planned for yet, but I couldn't wait another moment to tell you." "I wouldn't want to wait either," Izuku said, cupping her face gently in both hands, overwhelmed by a happiness that felt, in that ordinary kitchen on an otherwise unremarkable evening, like the natural, inevitable continuation of everything they had built together across years of shared trials and shared triumphs. "Whatever comes next, whatever this next chapter looks like, we'll face it exactly the way we've faced everything else together," Yayarozau said, the word carrying, as it always had between them, the full weight of every battle and every quiet victory that had brought them to this moment, this life, this family they were only just beginning to build. "Together," Izuku echoed, and held his wife close in the fading evening light, grateful beyond every word he could summon for the unlikely, extraordinary journey that had led a quirkless boy with nothing but notebooks full of hope into a life he had once believed entirely beyond his reach, a hero's calling fulfilled, a war survived, a marriage built on years of hard-won trust, and now, waiting on the horizon, a family of their own, the next chapter in a story that had begun, so many years earlier, with nothing more than a rope-tangled alley and a stranger worth helping. Chapter 35. The months that followed the announcement passed in a warm, anticipatory blur, Izuku and Yayarozau navigating the unfamiliar territory of impending parenthood with the same careful, collaborative thoroughness they had brought to every major challenge of their life together. They converted the apartment's small second room into a nursery over several weekends, Izuku assembling furniture with more enthusiasm than skill while Yayarozau, amused but touched by the effort, quietly corrected his mistakes without ever making him feel foolish for making them. Inko's reaction to the news, when they shared it during a quiet family dinner, was every bit as overwhelmed and joyful as both of them had expected, a fresh wave of happy tears accompanied by immediate, enthusiastic planning for every detail of her future grandchild's life that made Izuku laugh even as his own eyes stung with emotion. Yayarozau's parents received the news with matching delight, her mother already assembling a list of recommended pediatric specialists before the dinner had even concluded, her father offering a rare, unguarded smile that spoke more clearly than words could have. Class 1A's reaction, once the news spread through the ever-active group chat, arrived in the by-now familiar flood of enthusiastic messages, Uraraka declaring herself honorary aunt before anyone else could claim the title, Mina already researching nursery decoration themes nobody had requested, the whole found family embracing the news with the same warm, boisterous affection that had carried all of them through every major milestone since their earliest days together at UA. Izuku found himself, in the quiet moments between the growing excitement, occasionally returning to a particular, persistent thought, the long, uncertain road that had brought him here, from a quirkless boy who had once believed his dream entirely out of reach, through years of grueling training and mounting danger, through a war that had tested every reserve of strength and love he possessed, to this exact, ordinary evening, sitting beside his wife on their small couch, one hand resting gently against the growing evidence of the family they were building together. "I keep thinking about all the moments that could have gone differently," he admitted one evening, voice quiet with the particular vulnerability that only surfaced in their most private hours together. "If All Might hadn't been there that day with the sludge villain. If we hadn't ended up in the same class. If the war had gone even slightly worse than it did. Every one of those moments could have taken this away before we ever got the chance to build it. But they didn't," Yayarozau said gently, covering his hand with her own where it rested against her, steady and certain in the way that had anchored him through every uncertain moment across their years together. "Izuku, I understand the impulse to look back at every fragile point in the path and wonder how easily it all could have unraveled. I have the same thoughts, more often than I probably admit. But we're here. Despite everything the world tried to take from us, we're here, and we're building something extraordinary out of everything we survived together." Izuku pressed a kiss to her temple, drawing steadiness from her certainty the way he always had, and allowed himself, in that quiet, ordinary moment, to simply feel the full weight of gratitude for the life they had built, a hero's calling honored rather than abandoned, a war survived through partnership rather than isolation, a marriage built on years of hard-won trust, and now, growing steadily toward its own beginning, a family that would carry forward everything both of them had fought so hard, for so long, to protect. Whatever challenges still waited ahead, whatever ordinary and extraordinary trials parenthood and continued hero work would demand of them in the years to come, Izuku understood, holding his wife close in the quiet warmth of their small, hard-won home, that he would face every one of them exactly the way he had faced everything since a chaotic exam day Ali first brought Yayarozau Momo into his life, with full, unwavering devotion, and with absolute certainty that whatever came next, they would meet it together. Chapter 36. Their daughter arrived on a bright spring morning nearly 9 months after that quiet kitchen announcement, a chaotic, exhausting, overwhelming day that left Izuku more emotionally undone than any battle he had ever fought, and when the delivery room finally, mercifully quieted and he held his newborn daughter for the first time, small and impossibly precious against his chest, he found himself crying harder than he had at any point across the entire long, hard journey that had led him to this moment. "She has your eyes," Yayarozau murmured from the bed, exhausted but radiant, watching him hold their daughter with an expression of complete, overwhelming love. "I noticed it the second she opened them." "She has your stubbornness already," Izuku said, laughing through his tears as their daughter let out an indignant cry at being disturbed from whatever peace the swaddling had briefly offered her. "I can already tell." They named her Hannah, a name both of them had settled on months earlier during long, quiet evenings spent imagining the family they were building, and in the days that followed, as friends and family cycled through the small hospital room to meet the newest addition to their found family, Izuku found himself, again and again, returning to the same overwhelming sense of gratitude that had settled over him since the day the war finally ended, gratitude for a life built against every uncertain odds. For a partnership strong enough to weather anything the world had tested it against, and now, for a daughter who represented everything both of them had fought so hard, for so many years, to protect. Uraraka arrived first among their friends, immediately overwhelmed with happy tears at the sight of the newborn, followed by Ida delivering a characteristically formal but deeply sincere speech about the significance of new life, by Todoroki offering quiet, genuine congratulations, by Bakugo gruffly declaring the baby not bad, for a Deku, which everyone present understood to be the highest praise he was capable of offering. Inko, when she finally arrived, simply held her granddaughter in silence for a long, tearful moment, overcome with a joy too large for words. That evening, once the visitors had finally departed and the hospital room had settled into quiet, Izuku sat beside Yayarozau's bed, their daughter sleeping peacefully in the small bassinet between them, and reached for his wife's hand, both of them simply watching the small, precious life they had created together. "We made it," Yayarozau said softly, echoing words she had spoken once before, in a much darker moment, with an entirely different kind of relief threading through her voice now. "Through everything. All the way here." "We did," Izuku agreed, bringing her hand to his lips. "And whatever comes next, for her, for us, we'll face it exactly the way we always have." Together, they said together, the same word that had carried them through every trial since a chaotic exam day alley first brought them into each other's lives, now carrying forward into a future neither of them could fully predict but both of them, finally and completely, believed in without reservation. Outside the hospital window, the city moved through its ordinary evening rhythms, unaware of the small, extraordinary family beginning its own quiet story within those walls, and Izuku Midoriya, once a quirkless boy who had filled notebooks with borrowed dreams of heroism, sat in the gathering dusk beside his wife and daughter, holding on to everything he had fought so hard, for so long, to build, and finally, fully at peace. Chapter 37. Years later, on a quiet afternoon that carried none of the urgency or danger that had once defined so much of their lives together, Izuku found himself back at the same overlook on the city's outskirts where he had once, nervous and hopeful, asked Yayarozau to marry him. Hana, now old enough to run ahead of them along the familiar path, chased after a bright yellow butterfly with the same fearless enthusiasm she brought to everything, while Yayarozau walked beside him, her hand comfortable and familiar in his own after years of exactly this kind of ordinary, treasured togetherness. "Do you remember this spot?" he asked, though he already knew she did, watching her expression soften with recognition as they reached the overlook's familiar edge. "Of course I remember," Yayarozau said, leaning into him as they watched their daughter explore the nearby grass, sunlight catching golden hair only slightly less dark than it had been on the day they first met. "I think about it often, actually. How much has changed since that afternoon, and how much, somehow, has stayed exactly the same." Izuku considered the observation, watching Hana laugh as the butterfly finally eluded her, watching his wife's contented, familiar profile beside him, and felt the same overwhelming gratitude that had never fully faded across all the years since a chaotic exam day alley first set them on this unlikely, extraordinary path together. "I think," he said finally, "that the things worth building never really stop being built. We just keep adding to them, year after year, choice after choice, until one day you look up and realize the life you have is bigger and better than anything you could have planned for at the start." Yayarozau smiled, the same warm, unguarded smile that had first captured his attention across a chaotic testing ground so many years earlier, and reached up to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "I couldn't have said it better myself." They stood together at the overlook as the afternoon light softened toward evening, their daughter's laughter carrying across the quiet grass, two people who had built, out of chance meetings and hard-won trust and a war survived through unshakable partnership, a life neither of them could have fully imagined at the start but both of them, now, could not imagine living any other way. Whatever years still waited ahead, whatever ordinary joys and inevitable challenges the future still held for their small, growing family, Izuku Midoriya understood, watching his wife and daughter with a heart full past the point of adequate words, that he had found, against every uncertain odds a difficult world had once presented, exactly the life worth every sacrifice it had taken to build. And he intended to keep building it, together, for every year still to come. Chapter 38. That evening, as they walked back toward the car with Hana finally tired enough to be carried on Izuku's shoulders, chattering sleepily about butterflies and clouds and the small, wondrous details that filled a child's ordinary day with magic, Yayarozau paused once more to look back at the overlook fading into the evening light behind them. "Thank you," she said quietly, once Hana had drifted fully into sleep against Izuku's shoulder, "for choosing this. For choosing me, that day at the exam, and every day since. I know it wasn't always easy. I know the path here cost both of us more than either of us expected when we first started down it. I'd choose it again," Izuku said without hesitation, reaching for her hand as they continued toward the car, their sleeping daughter warm and safe between them, every single time, no matter the cost. "You were always worth it, Momo. You still are." She smiled, the last of the day's light catching warm in her eyes, and together they walked the rest of the way home, carrying with them a daughter who represented every hope they had once fought so hard to protect, and a partnership that had, against every uncertain odds a dangerous world had once presented, grown into exactly the extraordinary, ordinary life both of them had dared to imagine, so many years earlier, in a chaotic alley on the worst and best day of their lives. Thanks for listening.